For over a century, the legendary tales that have surrounded our great British airfields have inspired generations of people, including me, which is why I am on a personal mission to cross the UK to visit some of our most important airfields, to understand not just about their contribution to our past, but importantly, how many of them have helped define our future. From the UK's first flight, through to groundbreaking innovations such as carbon fibre and the jet engine, and the extraordinary effort spent on preserving our aviation heritage. Join me as I explore the story of the airfields that have helped shape Britain and the world. Well, this is what was once part of RAF Bentwaters, the last RAF base to be activated during the Second World War. Its first mission, a bomber escort in December of 1944. But it's the 4 decades that followed that conflict, the period known as the Cold War, that's really come to define what Bentwaters is really all about. For over 40 years, Bentwaters was in the front line of the defence of Western Europe, but not as an RAF base, because in 1951, the Americans moved in. And over the years that followed, they brought with them not just aircraft, but importantly, nuclear weapons. In its heyday, this sprawling complex was one of the most secretive and restricted sites in the country. Many of the aircraft shelters at Bentwaters today are used for industrial or agricultural purposes. But a few still house historic Cold War aircraft, keeping alive the spirit of the airfield. Al! Hello mate, nice to see you.
Hi Joe.
What a fantastic collection. Many people, I suppose, would be surprised to think that those men and women who fought during the Second World War would find themselves facing a new war, a Cold War. Who first coined the phrase?
The actual title of Cold War was actually christened by George Orwell. He wrote an article in 1945 about the nuclear future, and it said it would be a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the Western powers.
And that previous kind of allied relationship between the Western powers and Russia in particular was notoriously fractious even during the war, but it disintegrates almost as soon as the war is over.
It was. I mean, they had the common enemy, which was the Nazi Germany, but basically the Soviet Union and the West had nothing in common. One was totalitarian states, the other Western powers were democracies.
And in terms of the Russian perspective, obviously they'd suffered hugely during the war itself, but what were they seeking? What was their issue?
They were seeking, basically, they wanted to spread of communism around the world, which was basically Stalin's policy. The West themselves wanted free governments in Eastern Europe. The Russians would not allow that. The communists took over the Eastern European states.
And it became a game of brinkmanship, didn't it? Of spying, of counter-spying, of threat and counter-threat, and deterrent and counter-deterrent. And all of that is predicated upon the new nuclear age.
Yes, it was. When the Americans had the bomb in 1945, the Russians developed bombs with espionage, and their own scientists in 1949 was their first weapon, which is a copy of the Fat Man bomb. And then the development at pace went through to the thermonuclear weapons in the early 50s. Russia
and the Western Allies never directly came head-to-head, did they?
No, apart from instances with Francis Gary Powers in 1960 with the shooting down of his U-2 spy plane over Russia.
And of course the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And the missile crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is widely considered to be the most acute point in the Cold War, when the standoff between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was on the verge of turning into a full-blown nuclear conflict. In October 1962, the Americans discovered missile sites on Cuba, putting the United States within range of Soviet nuclear weapons. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further missiles and nuclear warheads arriving on the island. The Russians saw it as an act of war. Both sides were on a collision course.
Now, within this hangar, we've got some amazing examples of some of the finest, I suppose, post-war jet fighters and bombers ever built. Can we start with this one, probably the latest of the lot, the Jaguar? You're restoring this at the moment.
Yes. Originally designed to be a trainer, it was converted with the NATO change to a flexible response to any Soviet aggression to being a tactical nuclear strike aircraft.
And over my shoulder here, we've got the Lightning?
Yes.
What was the Lightning's role?
The Lightning was a Mach 2 interceptor, short range for defence of NATO areas. Very fast, very short range. It was designed originally as a research project by English Electric in the 50s and then was developed into a fighter.
And its primary role then, presumably, was in shooting down Russian bombers?
It was designed to intercept Russian nuclear bombers, yes.
And then in the corner, the unmistakable outline of the Meteor. That really, I suppose, is where the post-war jet age begins for the RAF.
It was the first British fighter into service with jet power in 1944.
Is it possible to ever come to any sort of a conclusion as to who would have won if, God forbid, the Cold War had turned into a much hotter war?
We'd all have been losers. As the Americans have said to me, I've been on trips to America before, and they said nobody would have won it.
From the late 1940s to the early 1990s, the high tension between the Western Allies and the Eastern Bloc triggered an arms race, both sides making enormous advances in aviation technology.
You know, the story of aviation engineering is one of a century of staggering technological advances, but perhaps the most pivotal moment was that leap from the piston-engine aircraft of the Second World War to the age of the jet. This pioneering invention, championed by a British engineer, would transform the future of aviation around the world.
In March 1930, a young Central Flying School instructor submitted the first patent for a turbojet engine. Sir Frank Whittle, known as the founder of the jet engine, had spent years developing and testing new methods for flying.
Frank Whittle at the time realised that we needed to fly higher and faster, and therefore we needed a different type of engine to do that.
By 1932, the patent for a turbojet had been granted, but with little support from the RAF and the Air Council, the patent became available around the world.
1 year after the patent was granted, the Germans started working on developing their jet engine. Their first jet engine powered aircraft, the Heinkel 178, flew in 1939, and then the British jet engine flew in the Gloster in 1942. Whittle, again, had difficulty getting his idea recognised, so that's why it took so much longer for the UK to actually have a flying aircraft.
Despite initial concerns about the development of the jet engine, the British government soon realised that air supremacy was vital, and it recognised the need to explore new technology, moving away from piston engines to the turbojet.
The jet engine, in simple terms, is suck, squeeze, bang, blow. The compressor sucks in the air and squeezes it to a higher pressure. That high pressure air then moves into the combustion chamber where the fuel is burnt in the air. There's a massive expansion taking place inside the combustion chamber which forces a jet of hot air out down the tailpipe of the engine, which pushes the aircraft forwards. It was very important to have jet engines to deal with the threat from the Cold War. Basically, Britain developed a number of aircraft, jet-powered aircraft. The Vulcan bomber was developed to carry an atomic bomb, if required, and also the Lightning, which was a supersonic interceptor aircraft. So it was extremely important for Britain to remain as a superpower, to have that technology.
With the new technology, the rate at which aircraft capabilities increased was staggering, ushering in a new era of aerial warfare.
Now, shortly before the Americans arrived at Bentwaters, it was home to a squadron of Meteors, the RAF's first jet engine fighter. Now, across the series, I've been lucky enough to fly in some fantastic aircraft, not least, of course, the Spitfire, arguably one of the war's most iconic aircraft. But in terms of technology, what's astonishing is that the later Spitfires were contemporary with the earliest Meteors. But what difference did the jet engine really make to the world of the fighter pilot? Well, as you can probably tell, I'm about to find out, because here at Coventry Airport, they've got one. Dan!
Cool, hi.
Good to see you.
And to see you.
And really good to see this, a fully functioning Meteor. Who'd have thought
Yep,
so?
absolutely. This is a great aeroplane. It was built here in 1956.
Wow.
And actually is very, very close to the original Meteor aeroplanes, which of course were flying at about the same time at the end of the war with Spitfires.
Now, one thing that I think is remarkable across the story of aviation over the last 100 years are the profound leaps and bounds that were made.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great example of it. The Spitfire, of course, very iconic, lots of different variants, but all propeller driven. And yet, contemporary to those later models, we've got the jet engine.
Absolutely, and it really, really moved on aeroplanes in speed, in height, and in flexibility, of course, because all of a sudden, this could go up to 60, 70,000 feet. And of course, the Spitfire with its propeller couldn't.
And rate of climb?
The very early Meteors were about the same as the Spitfire, but this one, of course, is much better. And I think you'll see if you come flying with me that this will be a lot better than the Spitfire.
Now, what have you flown before this?
Well, I was military before, so Harriers. I was then lucky enough to go to Edwards in America to do my test pilot course. So I flew all the sort of American airplanes, F-15, F-16s, and then went into the UK Civil Aviation Authority, and then flew airliners, so including the A380 and things like that.
Well, I am in very good hands,
Good.
clearly.
Let's
Brilliant.
go.
Right, talk me through it.
Okay, so if you would like to go around that side, you're going to put a foot in there and then step over and in.
Ooh, it's roomier than a Spitfire.
It is. Okay, that's us closed up.
Tiger 1, Roger. Report ready to touch.
Okay, Tiger 1. Okay, so here we go.
We can already feel that thrust behind me rather than the propeller, of course, where it's all at the front dragging you forward.
Exactly.
And nice to think, Dan, that this aircraft was built here at Coventry and she's still flying from here.
It was 1956 this particular aeroplane was built. As you say, actually here at Baggington, Coventry. Okay, you okay in the back, Jules?
I'm okay. My first flight in a jet fighter.
You're going to love this.
Be nice to me.
Okay, Jules, releasing in 3, 2, 1, now.
Oh, I can already feel myself being thrown back into my seat. Very light on the nose wheel. All that thrust.
So here we go, breaking the ground.
And we're up.
Up she goes.
Beautiful. Wow.
Okay, you ready for that roll?
Let's try a roll.
Okay, nose coming up a little bit.
Oh.
Bit of G.
Oh, yeah, there's some G.
And roll.
Oh, my God. Oh, there's the ground up my head. Oh, yes. Well, you get that one quiet.
A bit of G coming on.
Yep. Oh, there it is. Oh, I'm feeling quite compressed into my seat.
That's about 3G you're pulling at the moment.
That feels quite heavy, but very graceful with these two engines pushing us through the air. Thank you to the left.
You're doing about 400 miles an hour now.
Now, Dan, you were a test pilot yourself, of course.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it was like for those test pilots who'd grown up in Hurricanes and Spitfires, getting into one of these for the first time in 1943-44?
It must have been a very exciting age. Really must, because at the end of the day, it was just so much faster than the Spitfire and so much smoother, of course. Very quick acceleration, very quick to speed. It would take a Spitfire a long time to get to this sort of speed.
Well, when you think, you know, from say 1910 to 1944, when this aircraft first took to the skies, it's what, 30 years, 35 years. What a difference. I mean, just looking around me now at the cockpit, the instruments, the materials that were being used, those early pioneers could have had no idea what they were unleashing in terms of that technological rush that led to these aircraft.
Absolutely, absolutely. It came on in leaps and bounds.
Well, there we are. And a few more G just for the hell of it.
Beautiful.
Oh, look at that. The response of these engines is immediate.
It is. Completely different to what you might think from these early jet engines.
There we are. Not the clearest day in the world, but my goodness me. In many ways, it's not what you can see in these aircraft that makes a difference. It's what you feel.
Exactly. So coming into land then, doing about 140 miles an hour.
Not that you've known. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I could do this all day long. There we go. Graceful, graceful. Well, sadly that was over all too quickly, but I will cherish every moment, every minute and every second. In August 1945, more or less a year since the first Meteors became operational, the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing to a dramatic end the Second World War. But in so doing, they also ushered in a new age, the age of the nuclear weapon, and triggered an arms race that saw the world's leading nations scramble to equip themselves with their own devastating nuclear arsenals.
You know, Orford Nest has always been a very secret site, even since the First World War. It was all about secrecy and developing weapons, particularly associated with aerial warfare.
To keep up with the Americans and the Russians, the UK set about developing their own nuclear arsenal, and the first British nuclear weapon was tested in 1952. 8 miles to the south of Bentwaters lies Orford Ness on the Suffolk coast, and it's here that further testing was carried out.
The work started here in 1954 with the construction of the first of the laboratories, Laboratory 1, which looked at vibration and shock drop testing. Work pressed ahead on all sorts of weapons. Initially, Blue Danube, Britain's first operational atomic bomb, was tested here. Chief concern was about the safety of the devices. I suppose the most crude way of putting it was that they went off when they were supposed to and didn't when they weren't. They could conduct environmental tests on the device and its constituent parts. And what they were really trying to do was to put those parts through all the rigours they may go through, from storage to impact, and included things like vibration. So they were trying to mimic the vibration in an aircraft, shock drops, so accidental knocks and bangs, G-forces, G-pulses, all events that may happen.
The tests were carried out using dummy nuclear weapons. However, the bombs still contained considerable amounts of conventional explosives, in some cases up to 2.5 tons.
If anything should go wrong, that location, plus the fact that we have these massive structures, in some places 10-foot thick reinforced concrete walls and these huge roofs, and lots of shingle which provide mass in the event of an explosion to absorb that energy. All these buildings are still standing, so there never was a major accident here. Orford was an extremely important site. It's one of not many sites in the world associated with the development of nuclear weapons. What we're seeing, represented by particularly the buildings colloquially called the pagodas, is that they're really there as symbols of man's potential to destruction, really. I suppose you could probably sum it up in that phrase, MAD, mutually assured destruction. That's really what it was about. And within the Cold War, a lot of it was as much about posturing and about showing your strength to the other side as it was about actually your ability to actually, create the weapons or to deliver them. There is very little evidence of what happened in them. And over time, no doubt, further information will be released and images will come to light, perhaps showing what was going on in the buildings. But I think the key thing really is that they are very symbolic of that sort of mad time.
By 1952, the United States, Britain and Russia all had nuclear weapons, and the Cold War was beginning to heat up. The Western Allies, under the recently formed NATO, started to coordinate their defences, and America started taking over air bases right across Europe. With money seemingly no object, they invested heavily, building enormous bomb stores like this one at Bentwaters, filling them to the brim with weapons they hoped they'd never have to use. When the American Air Force first arrived at Bentwaters, their role was primarily to bolster the RAF's air defences. But in 1954, when they brought over their fleet of F-84 Thunderstreak fighter bombers, all that changed because the Thunderstreak could carry nuclear weapons. Richard!
Jules!
Hello, mate. I was just wondering how I was going to get in. It's
Thought I'd
astonishing.
open the gate for you.
Good to see you. I'm astonished to get the chance to have a good look at this. I mean, I've been shown around many things in my time, but never a former nuclear bomb store.
Well, there are very few of these left in the country anywhere, and there are very few that any civilian can get inside even now.
Well, it still feels very secure. I mean, these great big gates and these astonishing belts of wire and fences.
You've got the gate you've just come through, fully motorised, so when you want to bring your vehicle in, you drive up to the gate and the guy in the guardhouse lets you in, but he only lets you in this far.
So this is like a sort of area of containment, is it?
Absolutely, containment area. Your vehicle comes in here and you stop. They check out who you are and they say, yeah, you're fine. And that gate shuts. And when they're really sure that you're the right person, then they open the inner gate and you can carry on in. Otherwise, you're trapped. So if the wrong person's come this far, goodness knows how they'd have got this far, then they're not going to go anywhere further.
Now, you speak about this with great passion and conviction, Richard, and I understand that some time ago you had the job of guarding facilities like this.
Yeah, when I was a young flying officer in the Air Force, my first job actually was to be in charge of a flight of RAF policemen who were guarding an RAF nuclear weapons store. And so, yes, this is a bit of a stroll down memory lane for me, actually.
Well, it's all new to me. Come and show me around. Is it quite strange, Richard, coming back to a facility like this after so many years?
It is. It's also fascinating to look at the perimeter wire again and think about, you know, it's there to keep people out, 2 lines of wire to slow you down, so that there's a nice welcome party of security police as you arrive.
And of course the control tower, looks quite ominous even on a sunny day like today.
But it's the central point of the security system. And of course the most interesting thing is it looks directly down past all the doors to where they kept the nuclear weapons.
I'm astonished that I've got the opportunity to walk through this complex. I mean, back in its day, this must have been one of the most secure and secretive sites in the country.
Absolutely. And it's a really fantastic opportunity for us to be able to see it in almost pristine condition.
Well, yeah.
And if you just look up at the end there, can you see that building?
Yes, the orange one, yeah.
That's right. And the little windows in it, 50 caliber machine guns, ready to rake the area with fire if they've got through all of those defences and they're ready to try and break into the doors. One more line of defence.
So absolutely nothing was left to chance?
No, nothing at all. Everything is designed to make sure that these weapons could never be taken, damaged or harmed by anybody. Totally protected and always ready to be used.
Now, you will have seen these weapons during your time when you were protecting them. Give us an idea of the sort of role that they had. I mean, we're talking not about nuclear weapons that would destroy cities, are we? These are tactical nuclear weapons.
That's right. These weapons here are for fighter bombers, Thunderstreaks. And they're designed to be used on the battlefield against the vastly more superior numbers of the Soviet forces. So the fighter bombers will take off from here, they'll go over to the battlefield and they'll drop an atomic bomb on an advancing Soviet Guards tank army, for example. Hiroshima-sized bomb was about 15 kilotons. These could be as small as 1 kiloton. Now that means a blast area maybe half a mile or so. The point is, that's what you want, because you're trying to target the explosion in the area you need it to be used. You don't want to be destroying a vast area, civilian casualties and so on. You just want to be hitting the military formation.
So seeing a site like this, mothballed virtually almost as a museum, must in some ways please you.
This is great because this is the result of the Cold War having ended, and from our point of view, the Cold War having been won. The weapons were never used, the weapons have now been taken away. The site is quiet, and that's what we really wanted to happen.
It's absolutely amazing. It is eerie, but in a sense, there is a beautiful peace about it. The fact that it's now finished its role.
And peace is what it was all about in the end. Let's keep the peace. After 1945, there was tension for years and years, and there were threats and moments in world history where the worst could have happened. But fortunately, we got through that. And now the only noise we've got are the sounds of those birds.
Come on, let's enjoy the sunshine.
From 1958 The Thunder Streaks at Bentwaters were replaced with nuclear-armed F-101 Voodoos and later F-4 Phantoms. These would become key components in a new tactic called Victor Alert.
The Victor Alert tactic was all about speed, trying to get aircraft into the air within 5 minutes during moments of heightened tension. Pilots would wait next to their Victor Alert barns, which contained their aircraft that were fully fueled, the pilots themselves fully dressed, ready for action. In many ways, it wasn't unlike a scramble during the Battle of Britain, but on these occasions, they were armed with nuclear weapons. At the moment the siren went off, the ground crews would ready their aircraft, pulling out these arming pins, making all of the weapon systems, including the nukes, live. Meanwhile, the pilots would be racing into their cockpits. The pilots who leapt into their aircraft, just like this F-4 Phantom, adrenaline coursing through their veins, had no idea as they taxied out to the end of the runway whether or not they would be taking off into the midst of a full-scale nuclear war. Now, as it turned out, all the Victor Alerts were drills, exercises. They were never called upon to do it for real. But nonetheless, these pilots and their aircraft were in a constant state of readiness.
The British V-bombers used a similar tactic. This large strategic force was fully operational by 1958. It had been specifically developed to deliver the UK's nuclear deterrent.
The Vulcan, along with the other V-bombers, the Valiant and the Victor, became Britain's nuclear deterrent force. This was the only way in which Britain could respond to an attack from the USSR with nuclear weapons, until 1969, when the Polaris submarine from the Royal Navy took over that primary role, maintaining our nuclear deterrent. 15 minutes readiness meant you could actually be in a bed somewhere, asleep, and get out of bed, get whisked out to the airplane and get airborne within 15 minutes. And then greater states of readiness where at 5-minute readiness we'd be sleeping next to the aircraft in a little porter cabin type thing before they'd invented porter cabins. And then you'd just be in your flying kit, sleeping, and then you'd just have to rush out, jump aboard. And the aircraft were designed so that they could get the engines started and everything going in very, very quick time. 2-minute readiness, you're actually sitting in the seat, and within 2 minutes the aircraft could get airborne, get out of the way. Because in those days, the best thing that we could do in Britain was had a 4-minute readiness. We had radars detecting inbound missiles. They could then get the message to us, and we would get the scramble order, and we could be airborne before those missiles hit the ground, and a 4-minute warning. For me, I was only flew it from 1971. I was never actually ever found myself in a situation where I really thought something like this could happen. Unlike just only sort of less than 10 years prior to that, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's when the crews seriously were in their aircraft, fully armed, up with live nuclear weapons or the Blue Steel standoff missile, and they all didn't know whether the Hooter was really going to go and they were going to get scrambled. Thereafter, in fact, during the time when I flew it, from 1971 till 1982, then yes, we carried our one and only role was low-level nuclear strike, flying low-level, below radar cover, and using a single nuclear bomb, I don't know how many, probably 100 times bigger than Hiroshima, to go against the USSR, and that was our only role. And we played an important role, still part of NATO's Strategic Defence Force, and we would carry on that role right up until it went out of service in 1982. For me, during that whole time, I never really seriously had envisaged that I would actually have to go and drop a nuclear bomb on a city or on an airfield. People say, how could you do it? How could you sleep at night knowing that that was your job, which was my job? And the answer, quite simply, is I never really had lost any sleep over it or worried about it, because I never thought it would come to that. And it never did. I mean, this is the success of the nuclear deterrent was that we actually had the longest era of peace in the country for hundreds of years, I think, ever.
Bentwaters remained a nuclear-armed base throughout the fluctuating tensions of the 1960s and the 1970s, but in 1978 the whole place got a much needed upgrade to better deal with conventional and chemical and biological attack. This rather sinister looking building was the nerve centre for operations here at Bentwaters and at neighbouring RAF Woodbridge, and it was specifically designed to deal with chemical and biological attack. Now that capability, I am told, has been beautifully preserved on the inside. Well, these enormous blast doors tell you straight away this is no ordinary building. The whole thing was pressurised to keep contaminated air on the outside from getting into the inside. And I'm hoping I'm going to hear the ghostly voice of Graham, who's going to talk me through how I would make it into the nerve centre of RAF Bentwaters if there'd been an attack. Graham, are you there?
Hi Jules, welcome to Bentwaters.
You've just been subjected to a chemical attack, so we need to decontaminate you and walk towards your left towards the first decontam cell, and I'll give you further instructions.
Here we go, decon door number 1. This really is a spooky place. Graham, I'm in decon room number 1.
Right, Jules, what you'll need to do now is to remove all your clothing and place in the chutes that you see beside you.
This is a drill, and don't worry, I'm not going to take all my clothes off, but if it was the real thing, I guess they would go down there, and I would now be naked. Graham? Okay.
Next, you need to move into the shower area.
Graham, I'm in the shower.
You need to pull the chain attached to the shower head to give yourself a really cold shower all over.
I'm not even going to attempt to see if that is live and works. Graham, I've had a shower.
The next stage is to move into the final area where you'll find the towels to towel dry and a change of clothing.
All right, here we go. So this door would have been shut, of course. And look at it, it's like a conventional changing room in a school gym or something. So I put on a change of clothing. Hopefully I'm now decontaminated. And Graham, I think, should be through here. Graham, I think I'm done.
Excellent, come through the door.
At last, the man behind the voice.
Hi, pleased to meet you, Jules.
Good to see you, mate. I mean, that's a really graphic and quite chilling example of the lengths that we've gone to try and protect key personnel from chemical and biological attack.
It is. I mean, the personnel on station were obviously very key to the operation, and like I say, you had to protect them. And chemical attacks were a real threat. Not so much nuclear warfare, because that was always a last resort, and this building couldn't withstand a nuclear weapon.
But what kind of form would those chemical and biological weapons have taken? What could they do to people?
Nerve agents, blister agents, all kinds of nasty things. And they'd tie up key medical personnel on the base, so they really were an annoyance as well as a real threat to people.
And this building was built alongside those extraordinary hangars that are out there on the airfield today.
Yes, we've got 22 hardened aircraft shelters out there. They're all built as part of Project Creek Standard, which was a project throughout United States Air Forces Europe, which saw hardened command shelters, houses, all built up. And the mindset at that time had changed from having aircraft dispersed out on the airfield unprotected to putting all the aircraft under cover to afford them some protection.
So did the construction of buildings like this represent a shift in emphasis, a shift in perspective on what kind of form a future war would take?
It did. We'd moved away from the idea of any future conflict being nuclear, and it was considered that conventional, using chemical and biological weapons, would be the likely form of war.
And I suppose in many ways, I mean, nuclear war meant that nobody would win anything. The world would be completely destroyed. So a conventional war allows you to have something to capture, to own, I suppose.
Exactly, that's it. No one really wanted to see a nuclear conflict because, like I said, there would be nothing left for people to come back to.
Now, this was the nerve centre of Bentwaters. Can we take a closer look at where the action really happened?
Certainly, follow me.
Wow. So this was where all the action would have unfolded.
Yeah, this is the operations room. Take yourself back to 1980. This is the base as it was then. 6 squadrons of A-10s, 4 here at Bentwaters, 2 at Woodbridge. And the important thing to mention about the A-10 is that it signified a change of role for the base. No longer was nuclear strike part of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing's role. It changed to ground attack. And the A-10s based here didn't actually fly and fight from here. They were readied and sent to the front line in Germany to 4 forward operating locations.
So in a way, they were kind of passing through Bentwaters. When the balloon went up, they'd ship their squadrons to Europe, and that was their role done.
That's exactly it. The base would be redundant. These boards symbolise the state of readiness for each of the aircraft that was based at both Bentwaters and Woodbridge.
That's a very significant change in role from a base that was originally conceived to deliver nuclear weapons to the battlefield. Now it's moved on, and it's simply placing its units in Europe ready to go.
That's right, that's it. The battlefield for the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing with the A-10s was the east-west border, where all the Soviet tanks would be the big threat to Allied forces.
And the A-10 famously nicknamed, of course, the Tank Buster.
That's it.
Yeah. Did you just open the door and find this complete?
Unfortunately not. This was totally stripped out when we took it over. It was like a blank canvas.
Yeah.
Luckily for us, the equivalent building at RAF Tangmere was about to be demolished, and we managed to get in the nick of time to recover all the equipment and put back in here.
And how accurately have you managed to recreate this?
We had no photographs to work on, as the building was so secret. Very few people actually allowed access in it, but we did have one photograph to go by, which covered one area of the room. And we've had people come back who used to be based here and have said we've done a pretty good job.
Do any of those visitors give you any more detail? Can they talk about how secret it was in here?
They can't, because they've signed on the dotted line when they joined up, so everything's secret.
Well, certainly you've recreated the atmosphere, and I think it's fascinating for someone like me and like you who grew up during the Cold War to be able to come into a building like this and see what was going on behind the scenes that none of us knew anything about.
It is, it's absolutely fascinating. And there's still buildings like this in existence at places like Mildenhall and Lakenheath, and we even get serving USAF personnel come back to come and have a look inside this building so they can get an idea of what they can't see at Lakenheath or Mildenhall, which is quite funny.
You're lifting the lid on the Cold War.
Exactly, we are, yes.
Brilliant. Now, just as cracks were beginning to show in the Soviet Union towards the end of the 1980s, the Americans here decided to redecorate. These rather crude-looking murals pop up all over Bentwaters, but there's more to them than meets the eye. This hardened aircraft shelter was occupied by members of the aggressor squadron. Their job was to play the Russians during training exercises, and that's why they've decided to cover their hangar with a great big Russian bear.
The 80s were actually the frostiest period of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was a time in which there was an effort across the military to really visualize the enemy. On the outside of buildings, you would often see the use of official symbols, whether that was the insignia of the branch or of the different aircraft. Meanwhile, inside the buildings, you might see things that were a bit less refined. A lot of the murals that you see at Bentwaters were kind of informally created. They would have been done by individual airmen or groups. So they weren't using, terribly artistic materials. They weren't designed for a sense of, aesthetic quality. They were designed to build morale. One of the things that you saw created in the murals were an effort by different airmen to capture the insignia of their fighter wing. So one of the murals depicts a blue dragon. That's the symbol of the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing. In that mural, the blue dragon is kind of holding Great Britain as though it's a rock guitar in his hand. And the idea was it's kind of showing the spirit of cooperation between Britain and the United States.
The artwork found on many bases is firmly rooted in contemporary street culture. But there was a darker side to the designs.
So there's a lot of symbolism that appears in these murals. One of the things you see is that in one of the ammo or munitions group murals, you see an Air Force member who appears as Death. And the idea really is that in the Cold War, the United States and Britain were up against a foe that didn't really have a face, but that caused a lot of fear. So death sort of symbolizes the idea that death could come at any moment. There's one mural that has the slogan, "We live so that others may die." And this was a mural of the munitions branch. The slogan was a reminder of the constant presence of nuclear warfare during the Cold War. There was the possibility of the annihilation of a large part of the globe at any moment. And the munitions branch obviously would have been critical to that taking place. And the murals really brought that sense of home and identity to the different organizations within the military. They created a visual reminder of what it was these individuals were fighting for and who they were fighting against.
The Cold War finally ended in the early 1990s. The prolonged standoff and arms race had exhausted Soviet resources and resolve, and helped lead eventually to greater political and economic reform. As the relationship between the West and the East improved, the need for bases like Bentwaters diminished, and it was handed back to the British government in 1993. Today, it's privately owned, and only a handful of aircraft still use it. But it's a poignant reminder of this unique period in history.
I was born in 1970, just a few months after Neil Armstrong famously set foot on the moon. And like millions of other people, I lived through the next 20 years, the latter half of the Cold War, facing the threat of nuclear Armageddon. Growing up just a few miles from here, I went to school with kids whose fathers served and flew from bases just like Bentwaters and its sister stations. But as I look back on the Cold War, there is a certain irony to it. Both sides had developed the capability to destroy themselves and the world many times over, but in many senses, that in itself helped to preserve the peace. Well, today, the runway here at Bentwaters is silent, but this entire complex, I think, serves as a powerful reminder of the threat that we once all faced of a war that really would have ended all wars. Well, today we are diving into the story of the flying boat. This shingle bank is known as Calshot Spit on the south coast of Hampshire, overlooking the Solent and the Isle of Wight beyond. And in terms of the story of the Great British Airfield, it's unique because, unlike almost every other airfield, it doesn't have a runway. Why? Well, because it didn't need one.
Samuel Cody's first flight in the UK in 1908 started a revolution in aviation. Groups of enthusiasts around the country taught themselves how to fly and constructed their own aircraft. It wasn't long before the government became interested and started scouting for an ideal location along the coast.
Colin, the view from up here on top of the Coast Guard Tower at the northern end of the Calshot Spit really does give us a terrific overview of the natural geography that I suppose in many ways created the perfect seaplane base. If this shingle bank had been man-made, it couldn't have been designed any better.
You're absolutely right. It's the perfect location. It juts out into the southern end of Southampton Water. It's got 3 land masses to protect it from bad weather. New Forest to the west, mainland Hampshire to the east, and the Isle of Wight to the south. It's also got 3 separate water access points. The lagoon, which is very sheltered for most of the time, with Southampton Water behind it. And then to the south, we've got the 2 arms of the Solent, ideal for operating small, light, frail seaplanes and the heavier flying boats that were operated from here a little later.
When was Calshot first recognised as a potential airbase?
Well, the instruction went out from the government to create an air department for the Navy in 1912, and very soon after that instruction, suitable locations were identified. Calshot was one of the prime ones. They were scattered all around the coast, from the north of Scotland right round to Pembroke Dock in Wales, and Calshot was readily identified as being suitable for one such base for operations.
But once Calshot becomes established, it acts like a magnet for aircraft manufacturers who flock to this part of the country.
It was a major boat building and operating area, so the skills for building marine type aircraft, seaplanes and flying boats, were already in place from the boat building industries, of which there was a lot around. Supermarine, of course, the best known, based up in Southampton, started in 1913, but other names that are as well known: Vickers, Sopwith, Fairey, Avro, Saunders Row behind us, to the west, de Havilland, and many others. There were 26, 28 different manufacturers in this area.
Calshot was created naturally, but it was designed really for the seaplane, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. The identification of a need for seaplanes for an aerial surveillance operation for the Navy. The Navy weren't initially too keen on aircraft at all, but it was eventually realised that they were ideal for spotting purposes. As the submarine threat and surface vessel threats grew, so spotter aircraft became armed aircraft. They had to defend themselves, then they became attack aircraft, and the small seaplanes became larger flying boats. And Calshot grew from originally being an evaluation and testing establishment into a training centre, and that continued right up to the start of the Second World War.
I mean, talking about this fascinating subject, we talk about seaplanes and flying boats. There is a crucial difference between the two. How would you explain it?
In layman's terms, a seaplane is usually a smaller aircraft. The wheels are removed and replaced by floats. So the floats are on the water and the aeroplane stands above the water on those floats.
And the flying boat?
The flying boat is an aircraft whose fuselage has been shaped as a boat hull. So instead of being cylindrical, has an inverted V at the bottom. Its hull sits in the water rather than above the water.
Now, the terminology sounds obvious today, but who coined the word seaplane initially?
Winston Churchill is accredited with coming up with that word seaplane first. When he made his first flight from Hamble here to Calshot in August 1913, to have his first flight in an aircraft type that was at that time described generically as a hydravion, the French word, he is said to have coined the phrase seaplane, and it's stuck ever since.
The first aircraft to arrive at Calshot in 1913 was the Bat Boat, designed by Sopwith Aviation. Thomas Sopwith was a pioneer. It was his love of flying and speedboats that led him to the seaplane, and together with S.E. Saunders Boatyard on the Isle of Wight, they built the Bat Boat.
Well, the Bat Boat, it was an innovative design in that it used an existing technology in marine craft as the basis of the hull, and it was essentially the first real flying boat as opposed to aircraft that just skimmed over the water on floats or with skis. The basic hull is a classic Saunders hull, so you could have put an engine in it and driven it as a boat. The wing structure is conventional biplane wing with struts and bracing wires all tensioned up, so you've got a light structure with great strength. The engine was situated right in the centre of the aircraft between the wings, with a large propeller pushing the aircraft from behind. Some people ask how the name Bat Boat came about. Well, it's nothing to do with Batman and Robin, because they weren't around then, but it was from a mythical boat in a Rudyard Kipling short story that was very fast and had a sort of wing-like structure on it. So the name Bat Boat was derived from this Rudyard Kipling story.
The first flight of the Bat Boat was carried out by Thomas Sopwith before he handed over to his number 2, Harry Hawker. Hawker impressed the War Office by flying from 35 to 75 miles an hour and climbing to 1,000 feet in just over 2 minutes, with a passenger and 4 hours fuel on board.
The Bat Boat was seen as a spotting aircraft and also the possibility of maybe dropping bombs or attacking. So Calshot being just across the water from Solent was a natural place for it to go. Then, probably due to the needs of the First World War, the emphasis really rested on float planes for the smaller missions, and the flying boats were used mainly for the longer range patrol missions. And really it was the personalities and the people behind the original factories that had the drive to keep the industry together, creating, you could say, almost a moving art form. Those skills, I think, just got to admire it, what was done, and all the developments were done in materials and technology. It's an incredible story.
In July 1914, the Royal Navy reformed its air branch and became the Royal Naval Air Service, and they took over the Calshot base. The station's role expanded to take on the protection of shipping in the English Channel. A variety of flying boats were introduced, including the White Seaplane and the Short 184. It wasn't long before the new aircraft were put to the test.
They had moved towards training aircrew, weapons training, target hitting, torpedo dropping. The first successful torpedo strike was dropped by an aircraft flown by the station commander here the week before the outbreak of the First World War. And as the war progressed, so the aircraft were then diverted to channel patrols, reconnaissance work, looking for enemy vessels, surface vessels and U-boats, and working with units from other areas, Portland, Eastbourne, even Calais and Dover. They were successful in their attacks on enemy shipping.
Now, anti-submarine warfare from the air was clearly in its infancy. How many U-boats did the crews from here manage to sink?
There were successful strikes on U-boats, but not in any large number. It was more a case of they were being used as spotter aircraft, so our surface vessels could then find them. But nevertheless, I think they flew something in excess of 9,000 hours of patrol flying from here during that period.
On a calm day like today, Colin, looking at that lovely original Sopwith hangar, is it possible for you to imagine what Calshot was like back in those days?
Indeed, yeah, it would have been crowded. There are just 3 hangars remaining now, but in those days there were 6 growing to 7, 8 eventually under construction. All of the maintenance and training buildings that were required, the schoolrooms, the classrooms, the dormitories even, the accommodations, the railway line that ran through the middle, the men, the machines, yeah, it was a very busy place.
On the 1st of April 1918, the British Army's Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy Air Service combined to form the Royal Air Force, making it at the time the largest air force in the world. And in 1922, the prominent flying boat station became RAF Calshot.
With the First World War over, aircraft designers were free to spend some time improving their aircraft designs. Calshot became a site for coastal reconnaissance and a training unit for flying boats. But it also became home to the high-speed flight. I've come here to the Solent Sky Museum in Southampton to take a closer look at one of the flight's most famous aircraft.
The Schneider Trophy was started by a French engineer, Jacques Schneider, in 1913. The annual race was intended to encourage technical advances in civil aviation, but it soon became a contest for pure speed. The trophy was completed twice before being put on hold for the First World War. But as soon as peace resumed, they were back in business, and in 1929, the competition came to Calshot.
Well, Andy, here it is. This is what I've come to see. I never expected to see an original example of this kind of aircraft still surviving. It is remarkable.
This is the jewel in our collection of aircraft. This is the 1929 Supermarine S6A, and it's an aircraft which was built specifically for the Schneider Trophy.
Now, the trophy itself is legendary, and it's immortalised, I suppose, in the film The First of the Few, the story of Mitchell, the designer of this aircraft, and of course, the Spitfire. But what was it about the trophy that made it so alluring to aircraft designers?
Well, the trophy, it was a huge, glamorous affair. It was all about pure speed, of getting these aircraft up and getting them around the course as quick as possible, which really attracted not only the designers at the time, but also the different nations. Yeah. It was really seen as a thing of national pride to win the Schneider Trophy.
I suppose the nearest equivalent today would be Formula One, with the money, the glamour, the technology and the huge press interest that goes with it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you think of modern Formula One drivers as superstars in their own right. The pilots who flew these aircraft back then, they were front-page headlines. They were real pin-ups at the time as well.
But how important was the Schneider Trophy in accelerating aircraft development at the time?
Oh, it was massively important. They were then using that knowledge and then putting it into their next design of aircraft. What happened with this one, what Mitchell learnt, all these interesting aerodynamic pieces that he came up with, he then put straight into his next design of aircraft, which was the Spitfire.
And we have one conveniently sat next to us here in beautiful, beautiful condition. And you can certainly see the way the pedigree translates from the predecessor to the most iconic aircraft, arguably, in the world, one could say.
Absolutely.
But there is, of course, one major difference between the Spitfire and this aircraft, and the Spitfire is resting on its wheels, and this one, of course, has floats. Why was the Schneider Trophy predicated on seaplanes?
Right, well, the idea was that the future of aviation would be with flying boats and seaplanes. The reason being that most of our major cities are either on a big river or on a coastal port. And of course, if you're going to use passenger aircraft, big passenger aircraft, it makes sense to have them to be able to take off and land on water.
The story of the Schneider Trophy is now synonymous with Mitchell and, of course, the evolution of the Spitfire. But who were the competition?
Well, initially with the Schneider Trophy, before the First World War, it was a lot of privateers, people with a lot of money to spend on these aircraft. Some built them themselves and some private companies entered aircraft. But when we get to 1929, when this particular aircraft was built, the competition effectively are nations which are America, the UK, Italy and France. And all these are backed by large amounts of money given by the government.
In terms of Calshot, how important was the Schneider Trophy in establishing it as a base?
Well, Calshot was great. In the late 1920s, the high-speed flight, which had been formed specially to take on the Schneider Trophy, moved down to Calshot. And Calshot was a great location. On top of that, when it came to the actual competition days, and the course being run over the Isle of Wight down to Portsmouth and back, the Solent was a fantastic place for all the public to come and watch it. Because bear in mind, these aircraft are going very fast. Now, if you see an aeroplane at 500 feet doing sort of 300 miles an hour, it's gone pretty quickly. So to be able to sit there and actually look over the Solent and see it going right the way round was a great spectacle for the public. And that was important, the public engaging with this.
And what kind of speeds were they trying to attain back in 1929, 1930, 31?
The speeds were literally tumbling almost weekly as another nation produced another aircraft. They were breaking world speed records left, right and centre. They were aiming for a speed during the Schneider Trophy in 1931, around about 350 miles an hour. The next couple of days after they won the trophy, George Stainforth took one of these aircraft up from Calshot and actually broke the 400 mile an hour record right over the Solent. And you think about 400 miles an hour in 1931, when milk's still being delivered by horse and cart. That's a hell of a speed.
And when you think about it, it's only 20 years, really, since the first commercially useful aircraft really gets airborne. And yet in 20 years, you're attaining speeds of nearly 400 miles an hour. The effects on the pilots were probably less understood than they were on the airframe and the aircraft itself.
Absolutely. The pilots flying this discovered this phenomenon that as they turned tight in a corner when they were doing high speed, they suffered from something they referred to as fading out. They couldn't understand it. They were actually, their eyelids were getting heavy and they were losing their vision. We now understand that they were going under enormous G and they were actually starting to black out. Yeah. So these guys were, this is it, they were right at the front of that envelope pushing this, you know, not just the aircraft, but the effects on the pilot as well.
So it's not just the science of engineering, but it's also the science of medicine in a sense, which is being tested.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can we take a closer look?
Oh, by all means, come and have a look. Right.
God, this is a treat. It's very compact, isn't it?
It's tiny. You can get up here and have a look. There you go, if you watch yourself on there. So if I flip that open for you,
there we go. Wow, it is absolutely tiny, isn't it? And of course, there's no obvious forward vision.
Absolutely not. No, you can't see anything forward. You've got to rely on your crew to make sure they've cleared the way for you.
Can I get in?
You can have a go.
They were a lot smaller in those days, weren't they?
Oh, I think they were.
Now, am I right in saying, Andy, that this aircraft featured in the film, the first of the few?
Yeah, that's right. She was used as a prop in the film, and David Niven was sat exactly where you're trying to sit at the moment.
That was going to be my next question. How exciting is that?
Great.
So I'm not just following in Mitchell's footsteps, but also in David Niven's.
Absolutely. All you're missing is a slick back hair and a handlebar moustache. So.
Oh, my goodness me. Do you know, I hate to say it, but I think that's as far as I can go.
I know, you're not a big guy, but you think about cramming yourself in there. This is all red hot because the radiator's underneath you. There's oil chucking up in your face. You can't see where you're going. Amazing, isn't it?
Get out. Andy, that is absolutely remarkable. What a treat. I mean, not only have I followed in the footsteps of aviation history, but also in terms of movie history as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, mate.
No problem.
What a treat.
Good stuff.
But it wasn't just speed that was being developed at RAF Calshot. An Italian inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, saw the flying boats as a good way of testing his wireless radio in aircraft. With the largest maritime fleet, Britain was an obvious market for the long-distance system.
So Marconi began to spend time with the officers at Calshot and also to work with them to develop a system of wireless communications that might be suitable for seaplanes. They'd begun first using airships because the early apparatus was very, very, very heavy and some of the early aircraft just didn't have the engine power. But there was a clear and urgent need for wireless communications with aircraft, and so it was Marconi and his company that began to experiment before World War I to develop wireless systems suitable for communication in aircraft, including seaplanes. Marconi's wireless system worked on a very basic level. There was a transmitter and there was a receiver. So an electromagnetic wave would come from a spark transmitter that would come through the aerial here and then into the coherer. When the electric voltage passed through the coherer, the metal filings would cohere together, they would conduct to complete a circuit, and the circuit could be used to detect electromagnetic waves. So it was a very, very crude system, but it was a working system. And it was a working system of wireless telegraphy that could be used to pick up signals using Morse code. So when I send this signal here using this here, you can see that the coherer picks it up.
As the demand for aircraft communication grew, a new solution was needed. The position of enemy artillery and U-boats needed to be conveyed quickly back to base. Marconi developed radio valves, which could be used for radio telephony, so they could listen to voice instead of simple Morse code.
The radio valves meant that they could pick up continuous wave signals, but it also meant they could pick up radio telephony signals. So instead of listening to Morse code, the pilot was able to listen to voice, which made it much, much easier. These two sets, which are examples of civilian sets from the early 1920s, they were used in civilian aviation. So the technology made the transition from the military to the civilian, and these contributed to aviation communications in the 1920s and the eventual introduction of air traffic control systems, which contributed massively to the development of aviation safety.
Calshot had secured its place as the home of the seaplane, and with some of the biggest names in aviation based in the area, advances in technology and speed would aid the design of some of the most iconic aircraft of World War II.
During the 1930s, RAF Calshot continued the development of flying boats, but at the outbreak of the Second World War, its location here on the south coast and its close proximity to targets such as Portsmouth and Southampton made it easy prey for German bombers, and operational flights here were moved. As a result, the base concentrated on the repair and maintenance of flying boats, in particular the Short Sunderland.
Sunderland was first designed in the early 1930s, and it was designed by the Short brothers at Rochester, one of the most famous names in aviation history. The Sunderland was designed to go long distances over the ocean to watch over, protect our maritime trade. But it had many other roles as well, foisted upon it over the years, and it was very much a multi-combat aircraft in the end.
The Short Sunderland came into service in 1937, and over 700 were built. It could carry between 9 and 11 crew members. The huge aircraft had a wingspan of 112 feet and a length of 85, and could reach speeds of over 200 miles an hour. Its armoury was huge, with up to 18 Browning machine guns and the ability to carry bombs, mines and depth charges. The Germans nicknamed the Sunderland the Flying Porcupine due to its awesome defensive firepower.
To attack a U-boat was a very dangerous game. Sunderlands would have to come in at, say, 100 feet over the water, straight and level for a mile, to aiming for a very small target, which is firing back at you and moving very fast. And then the idea was to drop their depth charges, which were like a naval depth charge, each side of the U-boat. It was what they termed a straddle. And the idea was to get, say, 3 depth charges one side, 3 another, and then the joint explosion at, say, 25 feet would rupture the hull of the U-boat and send it to the bottom. Sunderlands are so rare nowadays, but we've got a genuine Battle of the Atlantic survivor, a Mark I Sunderland which sank in November 1940. And we've recovered many items from it. 2 engines, lots of cockpit parts, so many things that tell a story of this particular aircraft. Like these from the engines itself, the Pegasus engines. And this is how this valve comes out of the water. Very much encrusted, sometimes even worse than this. And then by the dedicated efforts of our volunteers, we turn it into this. And we can even split it into component parts as well. Without the Sunderland,
we would have been in a parlous state in the Second World War. It was one of our major assets and probably one of the most famous aircraft as well.
When Allied aircraft were shot down over enemy territory or forced to ditch over the sea, more than not, their lives depended on homing pigeons rather than the communications technology on board. At Calshot, they assessed various ways to release the birds as new aircraft designs became available.
Well, Stuart, Calshot seems a long way from here on the borders in the Malvern Hills.
But not for pigeons, you know. You know, in the First World War they flew relatively short distances. Second World War they flew very long distances, and it's been recorded one of the medal-winning pigeons flew 480 miles with a message.
Now, many people will be surprised at the use of pigeons given the amount of communications technology that was on board aircraft during the Second World War.
If an airplane had been shot down and you're the navigator bobbing around in a dinghy, you've got no access to the radio. So your good old pigeon is the way that you get a message back saying help. So the navigator would carry a box of 2 pigeons and it would tie a message onto the pigeon's leg with the coordinates calling for help. And they save many, many lives.
So how many pigeons have we got in here now?
We've got a dozen today, and they're from the loft that's at Tewkesbury, about 4 miles away, and they're all very experienced seasoned pigeons. As you can see, the weather's not ideal today.
And Stuart, what is it about the pigeon that makes it so well suited?
Well, they're just incredibly hardy. They've got this kind of dogged determination to get home. You know, there are well-recorded examples of pigeons flying home with bullets through its breast, one with a leg shot off, holes through its wings and so on, and covered in oil. You know, from a downed aircraft they were covered in oil, and they still managed to get those messages home, and it's just very brave, very determined animals.
And presumably there are rewards issued to anybody who found a pigeon.
Anybody finding a pigeon would have to take the message to the local police, and it was very rapidly escalated up the chain of command. And because time was of the essence, and it could make a difference, a few hours could make a difference between saving an aircrew's life. So vitally important, and the pigeons that brought these messages back were widely feted.
So how effective was it?
Very effective, and the actual percentage I'll write onto a piece of paper and put it onto a leg carrier, and I'll put it onto a pigeon.
So who's going to be the lucky bird to carry that?
I'm going to pick a pigeon at random, because at the end of the day they were picked at random to go with the air crews.
Yeah.
And hopefully when we get back we'll be able to answer it.
Well, it's a filthy day for flying. I don't envy you pigeons, actually.
Come on. Come here. Here you go.
Oh, there we go. That really is at random. And it just got a clips onto the leg?
Yeah, it clips onto the leg. Yeah.
Very simply. They're not bothered, are they?
No, not at all.
And how old can a pigeon live for?
The oldest pigeon on our record is actually 38.
38?
Yeah.
There we go.
There you go. I'll put her back in.
Yep.
And then we'll release them all together.
So there she is, back in the cage.
All ready to go?
Right then, so it's a simple case of
letting them go.
Right.
Here you go. Come on then. Off you go. Come on then.
Go on then.
Come on then.
Go on then. Hey! Tail end Charlie. Brilliant. Well, Stuart, here we are back at Pigeon Central.
Yes.
Are they starting to come back in now?
Yeah, they're coming back now.
You've got some other pigeons flying around here, but...
Yeah, those are our young birds, and they live in the loft behind us, and the experienced pigeons are just arriving back now.
Are they all back?
I believe so. They're beginning to split off the bunch. There
Oh,
they
look,
go,
look
there's
at
some
that.
more coming. There you
That's
go.
incredible. Now, the key question is...
Is the message there?
Is the message there? Yeah, exactly. Come on, let's have a look.
Right. Here we go. Okay, I think Jeremy's going to hand it to us. There we go. Here's the pigeon with the message on its leg.
You just unclip that?
Yeah, I'll just take it off. Come here, and I'll hand the brave pigeon back to his owner, Jeremy.
Well done, you pigeon.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jeremy.
Thank
so
you.
just to remind ourselves, I asked you the question, how successful were pigeons in getting their messages back home?
Right, okay.
You wrote the answer on this bit of paper earlier.
I did, and this number may well surprise you. It's a combination of the success rate in World War I, where they flew very short distances, and World War II.
Yeah.
And the combined total was a total of 96%.
That's incredible. But what was the furthest distance ever recorded for a pigeon bringing back a message during the war?
Within the Second World War, they flew many hundreds of miles, typically 300-400 miles. And today I've got a medal awarded to a pigeon called Mercury. And Mercury flew back from occupied Denmark 480 miles with a message.
That's incredible. And this is the original medal?
That's the original medal, yeah. It's a Dickin medal. They're the Animal Victoria Crosses.
For gallantry, we also serve.
Yep.
That's lovely, isn't it? And on the back, what do we got? Oh, Mercury, Army Pigeon Service, Special Section, Denmark, 1942.
Yep, and because Mercury was an experienced pigeon, he'd flown back from the continent on numerous occasions before his special mission. And his special mission was to bring a message back about German warships leaving Denmark to attack Allied convoys.
Brilliant. And it seems rather fitting then that Mercury, the messenger of the gods, should have won this particular medal. And it's interesting, Stuart, because these days pigeons tend to get a bad press, particularly in our urban areas. But actually, we've got a lot to thank them for. They're not just pests, are they?
No.
They're heroes in their own right.
They're very much heroes. And in the First World War and the Second World War, saved many thousands of lives. So yeah, very brave, very, very brave animals.
At the end of the war, in 1945, Calshot grew in size once again, when 2 squadrons arrived, 201 followed by 230, both equipped with Sunderlands. Defeated Germany had been divided into occupied zones, American, British, French and Soviet. But Berlin was also split, so no one country could rule the capital. But by 1948, the Russians wanted Berlin for themselves.
During the Berlin crisis of 1948, Calshot Sunderlands were once again called into action. Flying from temporary bases near Hamburg, they flew right into the heart of Berlin itself, using the city's lakes, bringing in food and evacuating children.
We knew that, of course, the Russians had decided to close the land borders from their zone of Germany to prevent the Allied convoys from travelling overland by rail or by road to Berlin, where, of course, we had the 3 Western Allied sectors in West Berlin, French, American and British. And with the borders closed at land borders, there was no other way we could supply Berlin.
With no food getting to the capital by land, the only alternative was by air. The British air corridor went from Hamburg to the British sector of West Berlin.
At first, it created a problem at Hamburg because the normal facilities we had at Calshot for mooring the aircraft and for refuelling were not available in the normal way. To begin with, therefore, we had a refueling problem and we were limited to about 1 sortie a day. But within a week, a normal standard RAF refueling barge had been brought out by ship, and then once we'd got that, we were able to carry out very rapid turnarounds, and each crew then were flying at least 2 to 3 round trips to Berlin every day.
The operation became known as the Berlin Airlift and lasted for more than a year. It brought in more than 2.3 million tonnes of essential supplies to the beleaguered city.
The Sunderland was chosen because it had a large capacity, and so it was, from that point of view, ideal. And apart from the types of cargo we took, which were mostly tinned food that could be easily transported, apart from that, the Sunderland was also, to some extent, protected against salt corrosion. And therefore, one of our cargoes also was the salt, which was a necessary ingredient. We carried 10,000 pounds weight of cargo each run, and for a time, although we came back empty, then Berlin itself was starting to manufacture goods to be exported to the West, and so we were bringing back cargo from Berlin, and then eventually the food situation got rather desperate, and therefore they decided that young children from Berlin should be flown out to Western Germany, and so we had the pleasure, in fact, and enjoyment of carrying these kids out from Berlin.
At the height of the Berlin Airlift, a supply aircraft took off or landed in West Berlin every 30 seconds, making a total of nearly 300,000 flights. The Calshot Sunderlands alone performed over 1,000 sorties.
Now this was one of the last aircraft to land at Calshot. It is of course a short Sunderland. This one was built in 1943 and then converted to civilian use in 1947 when technically it became a short Sandringham. Now in a series that frankly has spoilt us with some of the most beautifully preserved historic aircraft in the world, picking a favourite is tricky, but this is mine and I'll tell you why. You see, modern air travel is fast, it's cheap, but we are shoveled into airliners like cattle. There's no sense of romance or elegance or luxury about it. But imagine taking off from the Solent and heading down to Singapore on a 7-day odyssey in one of these. It's much more sociable, there's loads of legroom, 5-star service, there was even a bar and you could go to sleep. You take off and land in the south of France one night, then head down to the Nile and then drop in for drinks on Lake Victoria. I love the Sunderland because I think it could work again. And this is the cockpit. Here we are, the upper deck, the business end of this particular Sunderland. And imagine all the sights that would have been seen out of that particular cockpit. This aircraft flew, well, pretty much for 40 years all over the world. Australia, New Zealand, South America, the West Indies. In the 1970s, it was owned by an American test pilot called Captain Charles Blair. He was married to the Hollywood actress Maureen O'Hara, and she had that chair put in so she could sit with a little more comfort next to her husband on those long flights. It's even got an ashtray and a cup holder. Now, in many ways, looking at the Sunderland, it looks short and stocky. It is an incredibly robust aircraft, but imagine if you could travel the world in one of these once again. A real home away from home, a taste of aviation elegance. It wasn't just the British who recognised the military value of the flying boat. Other maritime nations, such as the US and Canada, also saw that it could have a vital role to play. I've come here to the Imperial War Museum at Duxford to take a closer look at the American answer to the short Sunderland, the PBY Catalina, and to meet a group of enthusiasts who have now dedicated themselves to keeping this veteran aircraft in the air. Hey fellas, it's Jeff up there.
Ah, Jules.
How are you, mate?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very pleased to see this old lady.
Yeah, well, welcome to Duxford and to Miss Pickup.
Beautiful. This is much, much bigger than I was expecting.
Well, 104-foot wingspan. It's about the same size as a 737, so not small, that's for sure.
I've probably spent a bit too long looking at short Sunderlands to really appreciate just how beautiful this aircraft is. Can we take a closer look at the nose there? I'm fascinated by the sort of boat nature of it, the hull, as it were. Look at that. I love the flare.
Well, it is very much a hull, and of course it takes you back to the early days of flying boats, and it was a combination of marine and aviation coming together.
Can we take a closer look inside?
Yeah, come on around.
Wow.
Just watch your head, Jules.
I will. Gosh, it does certainly feel more boat than plane, doesn't it, when you get in there and you see the shape?
And you've come in the easy way. Wartime, they would have come in through one of these blisters.
The blisters do give you a remarkable view, don't they?
These were huge observation points. You had a fantastic panorama to look out for convoys, for downed airmen, spotting subs. It was quite a critical task.
And what would have been in this area here? You've obviously got some modern seats at the moment.
Yes, but in the old days, on one side you would have had some rest bunks, and on the other side, the port side, you would have had a galley there so they could prepare some food.
But having a galley, that's quite a luxury in a wartime aircraft, isn't it?
It was. You wouldn't have found it in a lot of aircraft. Catalinas were special, but then Catalinas were special in the sense of their capability of flying long distances for a long period of time. So you needed something like that. But then, don't forget, flying up in the Arctic, it wasn't very warm up there, freezing conditions, so you needed some hot coffee to sustain you whilst the action was on.
Yeah, you certainly want to make sure the kettle was on, wouldn't you?
Yes, definitely.
All the way.
Yeah.
Come on then, Jeff, let's have a look around the
come
rest
and
of
see
it.
the rest of the aircraft.
This is fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
And you're coming into the engineer's compartment now. Jules, I'll climb in, and if you poke your head through, you'll be able to see what there is to see in terms of controls and instruments here in the cockpit.
Gosh, it really is pretty tight in here, isn't it?
It is. Catalina pilots are slim chaps.
There really isn't a lot of room, but great, again, all-round vision up here.
Yes, very much so. And you can see back behind you, obviously an excellent view to the front.
Yeah.
And if on the water, you can actually stand on the seat, provided you don't lean back into the props, you're all right.
And it's interesting, all the controls are up above you there.
Yes, a little bit different to wartime usage because the mixture controls and the fuel levers, they would have been in the pylon operated by the flight engineer. But by the very nature of how we operate the aircraft these days, having it all here gives the pilots total control of the operation.
Now, I gather that your chief engineer, Gary, is on top of the wing, is that right?
Yes, they're doing some work with the engine, so a case of, would you like to go up and see the size of the wing?
Well, I will. What's the best way up?
I think back that way and up through the ladder.
Right, I'll see you later.
Good.
Gary?
Hi, Jules. Come on up.
How'd you get up there, then?
Straight up the middle of it.
Little step here?
Yeah, I'll give you a hand if you like.
Oh, lovely.
There you go.
Wow.
Taking the view.
This is a sight you don't see every day.
No.
From the top of a Catalina. And it's lovely to see this huge expanse of wing. You don't see that on a modern aircraft because the fuselage is always in the way.
Exactly, it's in the way, but we've got the whole thing up here to run up and down.
It doesn't look as if it's actually attached to very much under there.
Just 6 bolts.
6 bolts?
Yeah.
But when you think about the stresses and strains that are going through the airframe and those 4 struts that are holding the wing on and all that power racing through these engines, through the airframe, is immense.
It is, but they obviously thought about it. But then they did the battleship thing and just overbuilt it.
What are the big challenges in maintaining a seaplane as opposed to a normal aircraft?
It's an aircraft, it's also a boat. And of course boats float, and any damage to the lower hull means it's going to sink. So we have to make sure that the lower part of the hull is always watertight.
But the annual maintenance schedule that you're engaged in year after year is huge.
It's 70 pages. Yeah.
A checklist of 70 pages.
Yeah, and we have to look at everything on the checklist every year. So we're in here for 6 months.
And to your knowledge, Gary, how many Catalinas are still flying around the world?
I believe around about 10 currently still active.
Just 10?
Hmm.
So despite all the work and all the huge expenses involved, it is absolutely worthwhile, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, the shareholders will testify to that. You know, you'd think, well, why would people want to do this? But they do.
Well, Gary, you've clearly got plenty to be getting on with. I won't hold you up anymore, but thank you very much indeed.
Jules, it's been a pleasure.
By the 1950s, Calshot was primarily used as a marine craft maintenance facility for the RAF. But with the decline of the seaplane and flying boat fleet, the base finally closed in 1961.
You know, unlike bombers and fighters, the seaplane is an altogether much more romantic proposition, combining those heady elements of air and water. These days, seaplanes still operate around the world, but often in its remoter parts. You'd be pretty lucky to see one. And I can't help but feeling that, in some ways, the seaplane tail was cut prematurely short. And I'm often left to wonder what would have happened if the scientists and engineers of yesterday had had the technology and the opportunity of today. I suspect, and I hope, that the seaplane story might have been very different. These now derelict hangars are all that survive of RAF Tangmere. But like its sister fighter stations such as Biggin Hill and Duxford, its role in the Battle of Britain during the Second World War has become the stuff of legend. Thousands of people witnessed ferocious air battles that characterised the campaign up in the skies above me from the safety of the ground below. But Tangmere's history also tells of another story, a story that at the time was shrouded in secrecy. It's the tale of covert operations run by Britain's Special Operations Executive.
The only evidence of RAF Tangmere today is the Military Aviation Museum situated in the corner of the old airfield, revealing stories of bravery, pain, defeat and victory, especially those summer days in 1940 when the Battle of Britain virtually destroyed it.
You know, Dave, whenever I come here, I'm astonished at just how extensive the museum's collections are. It's a proper labyrinth full of the most amazing material. But tell us a little more about Tangmere and the origins of this airfield.
Okay, well, that's why the museum is here, of course, because of Tangmere. And it goes back to October 1916, when a lieutenant in the Royal Flying Corps, Geoffrey Dorman, was flying overhead. And he had a motor problem with his biplane, First World War biplane, and had to make a forced landing. And he made a forced landing on Church Farm, Tangmere, repaired his aircraft, got airborne, but then reported back to his bosses that this would be a superb place to build an airfield.
You know, so many airfields I have visited have been discovered because of some sort of mechanical malfunction. Somebody's landed and then thought, actually, this would really work, and then they've been developed. It's amazing, really.
And what happened then was that the Americans were joining the war in April 1917, and they needed airfields because they were going to train on bombers. So in September 1917, this land, this church farm, was requisitioned by the War Department, and the airfield was constructed. In March 1918, it was still, well, the Royal Flying Corps were here with 3 squadrons, but actually it was an American airfield. The Americans arrived, but sadly their aircraft, these Handley Page 0400 bombers that were being built in America, they didn't arrive before the armistice.
But the airfield stays in being throughout the interwar period, and then of course we get to the Second World War, and any account really of those early months and years of the campaign is incomplete without talking about the Battle of Britain, and Tangmere plays a central role in that.
Well, indeed, but let me show you something.
Got something stashed away out the back.
This is it, Jules. This is one of our 26,000 artefacts, probably the most important one.
This is astonishing, actually. What am I looking at?
This is a crashed Hurricane. It was crashed on the 30th of August 1940 during the Battle of Britain. A young sergeant pilot, 20 years old, Dennis Noble, took off from here and sadly was shot down over Brighton.
It's a remarkable piece of forensic archaeology, really, isn't it?
It is. And this particular aircraft shot down 6 enemy aircraft in August 1940, flown by the squadron leader, 43 Squadron, Tubby Badger. And on the 16th of August, he actually shot down 3 Stuka aircraft south of South Sea Bill.
Now, the 16th of August 1940 is a big day in the history of Tangmere. How would you describe it? What happened?
Well, the station commander at the end of that day described it as a victory for the Royal Air Force. And the reason was, even though this airfield was heavily bombed that day, it remained operational. And what actually happened was, about noon of that day, it was a Friday, 2 chain home stations, radar stations, Poling and Ventnor, they saw a build-up of enemy aircraft over Cherbourg, and it was actually 150 aircraft.
The German bombers, protected by Messerschmitts, headed towards the south coast of England. They broke formation just off the coast, with one group heading to Portsmouth and one towards the radar station at Ventnor. But the biggest group were heading directly for Tangmere. The Luftwaffe were determined to destroy the RAF on the ground.
Now, some got through and they were very accurate. The Germans were incredibly accurate. No bombs dropped outside the airfield. All but one of the hangars were destroyed and a lot of the buildings were destroyed or badly damaged.
The names of the pilots that served here during the war read like a who's who of the RAF. Barder, of course, tops that list. But do you have any other favourites?
Well, there's Billy Fisk, of course. Billy Fisk was here. He was American. He was an adventurer. He loved speed, but he loved England. And he married an English girl. He married her in 1938. And they went back to America. And then war was declared. And because he knew 601 Squadron pilots through his skiing, so a lot of them are very keen on skiing. Willie Rhodes Morehouse was one, Mouse Cleaver was another. He wanted to get into 601 Squadron.
Well, you mentioned 601 Squadron, famously known as the Millionaire Squadron. These were the pre-war elite. Many of them enjoyed flying privately, had their own aircraft, and yet Come the war, they galvanised themselves into a squadron which does fly with great distinction during the campaign.
It's an auxiliary squadron set up in the mid-1930s. Lord Edward Grosvenor set it up.
Well, the name Grosvenor says it all, really, doesn't it? When you talk about those pre-war circles of money and privilege.
Yes, that's right. And so they knew each other through being with 601, and that's why Billy Fisk wanted to come back and fly with them.
601 Squadron was formed in White's Gentlemen's Club in London and was made up of aristocrats and adventurers. The millionaires had a reputation for escapades and flouting the rules, but their privileged upbringing didn't shield them from the brutal realities of war. From an initial strength of about 20, they lost 11 men in action.
For any pilot flying during the Battle of Britain, it was a great leveller. Up in the sky, there were no boundaries.
Absolutely not. No, rank meant nothing. Sergeant pilots did as well as squadron leaders, and many survived, of course. And an example of that is Darky Close, who was a sergeant pilot. Before that, he joined the Royal Air Force as a Holton apprentice at the age of 16, did very well, was offered the chance to fly, learned to fly, joined No. 1 Squadron, and did very well in France at the beginning of the war, in the Battle of France. Going back to the 16th of August, that evening, his squadron were detailed to come back to Tangmere because of the losses the squadrons had experienced. Then over Guildford they met a huge number of German bombers, and he shot down at least one Heinkel 111. And that particular aircraft, we have part of it here.
It's a difficult question, this, but if Tangmere hadn't existed, say, how might we have fared during the Battle of Britain? How crucial was it?
Well, there'd been a big gap in the defences, I think. And when you consider that in July and August, if you like, the main 2 months of the Battle of Britain, aircraft from this airfield shot down 275 enemy aircraft. So it was very, very important.
In 1940, as the threat of invasion loomed, various measures were put into place to try and thwart it. Some of them were fairly simple, like taking down all the road signs to confuse the enemy, but others were much more strategic. You can still see today, dotted across the landscape, hundreds of pillboxes, fortified bunkers that formed elaborate stop lines to try and meet any invasion should it get ashore. Now, chief amongst sites to be protected, of course, were Britain's airfields. Now, the pillbox was essentially a fairly simple reinforced concrete structure, but here on our aerodromes, the engineers went in for something that was altogether far more elaborate. Hello, Robin.
Hi, Jules.
Very nice to see you.
Very nice to see you, sir, as well.
Now, this is a bit different to the norm, and I'm used to seeing those hexagonal structures all over the place. As a kid, my mum and I used to play games spotting them to try and alleviate the boredom of long car journeys, but this is altogether something different.
It is absolutely. It's a Pickett-Hamilton retractable fort or turret.
A Pickett-Hamilton retractable fort?
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
And the idea retractable is the idea that it was raised up from the ground level. Had the airfields come under attack from enemy aircraft or parachutists or anything, it would come up out of the ground. It would fire, obviously, at the enemy, and then at the end of any action, it would sink back down into the ground again.
So it's a brilliant idea of leaving the airfield itself unlittered by these huge concrete structures.
Absolutely, yes. Every airfield had these in the UK. There were 3 on every airfield placed alongside the runways, and Churchill was very inspired. He saw one in action. He said to General Ismay, who was his chief of staff, he said, "Let me have details, I want these on every airfield." And so they were.
So as I'm looking at it now, it's effectively closed.
Just lowered.
Lowered. That's the technical term.
Yes.
But yours works.
Yes, it does indeed. Let me show you, Jules.
Can we stand on top of it?
Yes, you can.
Brilliant. Look at this. It's like a huge manhole, isn't it?
It is. It's a colossal amount of concrete, actually.
Gosh.
There.
Not a huge amount of room.
No, it's pretty cramped in there. You would have had 3 airmen in there, Jules, with all their ammunition, the brain gun, all their packs and everything else. It was very cramped.
You'd have to imagine that whoever was detailed to serve in these had probably done something really bad the day before.
Dreadful. I wouldn't think they'd volunteer either.
But presumably the space kind of obviously increases as it rises.
As it comes up, you would have more room, yes, absolutely.
Should we see it work?
Yes, absolutely. Why not? Yes.
What's the command?
Off we go.
Hey, presto, open sesame. There we are, that's your modern hydraulics taking over.
That's right.
How were they powered during the war?
It was either by a compressed air bottle or a hydraulic handle. You know, the air bottle sometimes didn't quite have the energy to push it up that quick, so they supplemented it with a hydraulic handle. And that brought it up. It could be raised in 6 seconds and lowered in 3.
Wow.
But not today.
Well, to be fair, it is, what, 70, 80 years old. But you can just start to see there, you know, the greater volume of space that's being created and the firing step. That's interesting.
Yes, you can. And as it comes up, you'll see the actual firing slits where they fired from. And we have actually put an imitation machine gun on this one, so...
But I suppose, in a way, it's quite a clever sort of prefab, isn't it? You can see this kind of brought into airfields very easily.
It was very, very clever. There were about 300 of them, but 300 plus built.
Yeah.
And all the airfields had them.
When you think about the standard pillbox and what you could fit in there,
yes,
and with modern weapons, the field of fire that they would have had across an airfield, in a way, these probably didn't need to be right next door to the runway, did they?
No, but that's where they placed them, because if an enemy attack did come, or paratroopers came, then it was in the ideal situation to attack.
And let's face it,
defend the airfield.
If Churchill said he wanted them, they had them.
Indeed, yes. He was the inspiration behind it.
It is surprising what you can find lying around an old airfield in Kent, Robin.
It certainly is, Jules, isn't it? Yes.
Well, well done to you and the rest of the game for restoring it. It
Thank
really
you.
is
Thank
a
you.
treat.
Britain's airfields and the RAF aircraft flying from them were the first line of defence during World War II against an advancing German army. Never was this more true than at Tangmere. It played an essential role in the Battle of Britain.
The Battle of Britain wasn't really a battle at all. It was actually a campaign. And just what that campaign, which was launched by the Germans, was trying to achieve is also unclear. One thing they were certainly trying to achieve was air superiority over southeast England. Whether they were trying to prepare for an invasion or not is not entirely clear. They were failing at the beginning, they were failing in the middle, and they were failing at the end. And one of the worst things for them is they didn't know it. They weren't clear about the nature of the losses on either side. They grossly overestimated the losses they were inflicting on fighter command. We, by the same token, overestimated the amount of damage we were inflicting on them, but that didn't matter so much. All we had to do was to keep going.
The Battle of Britain was one of the turning points of World War II and prevented Germany from invading Britain. It was also the beginning of Germany's bombing campaign on London.
The biggest raid of all, when the Luftwaffe launched what was pretty much a maximum effort on the 7th of September, the first major attack on London, was described by one RAF pilot who encountered it as looking up the escalator at Piccadilly Circus. The whole sky was covered in more than 700 German aircraft. And not only would you have had that sight, you would have had the sound as well, of course. Individual aircraft, okay, you can hear the odd one, but when you've got a massed air fleet like that, it's really impressive, the sort of droning sound. People got used to the distinctive sound of the German engine, which used to hum in a particular way. Overall, fighter command inflicted 1.8 times the losses on the Luftwaffe as it suffered itself. So one way in which you could add up the numbers at the end is to say that the Luftwaffe lost 1,887 aircraft to 1,023 in fighter command, 1.8 to 1 to the RAF. But of course, that's only one way of looking at it. If you think that the Battle of Britain was about protecting the country from invasion, the rest of the Royal Air Force was also involved. So if you look at that, then in round terms, the RAF lost about 1,500 aircraft to the Germans' 1,900. Either way, it's still a clear RAF victory. The Germans never came close, and they didn't realise it until the very end.
But it wasn't just fighting out in the open that gave the British an advantage. One of Churchill's secret assets during World War II was the Special Operations Executive, an organisation tasked with encouraging and facilitating espionage and sabotage behind enemy lines. If you like, an underground army.
Now, Churchill was determined that his SOE agents would set Europe ablaze by whatever means possible. The more unconventional, the better. They need to be hand-picked, they need gadgets, and they need somewhere to train out of sight of prying eyes, which is why I've come here to the heart of the Beaulieu estate in Hampshire. So John, why Hampshire? Why the Bewley estate?
Well, before the war, there was a former Gurkha officer who joined the SOE as one of the staff in London, and he tipped off the senior officers up there that the Bewley estate was the ideal place to hide secret training schools within the Montague estate. And this spread from right in the north of the estate right down to the coastline down here on the Solent.
So across the estate there were numerous facilities that could be used, none of which could be seen from the other, I suppose.
That's
Looking
right.
at these woods here, I mean, it's very dense, isn't it?
Yeah, there were no major roads in Bewley, as in fact is the case now. They couldn't be seen from the road, they were shielded by these screens of trees, and therefore it was a very good place to hide your agents away for their training.
And did it also play into the notion that agents shouldn't know too much about what their compatriots were up to?
That was very much the case. We are standing within a few yards of where the headquarters building was, just over there.
Over there.
It was called the Rings. It's not there anymore.
So in a way, I suppose the trainees were living a sort of tactical life here within the bounds of the estate, as they would have to do when on active service.
One of the priorities here was for the agents to be able to prove that they could maintain their own security, their personal security, and so they wouldn't have known one another's names. They may have been in buildings here with a number of other agents that perhaps had come from other countries that they'd not met before, and they worked under code names, and they just didn't know anything.
Do we know how many passed through here during the war?
Between the war, certainly in excess of 3,000. Not all in one group.
Yeah.
They came in little clusters through from the middle of 1940 until the end of the war in 1945. Special Training School 31 was the headquarters building.
Okay.
This building alongside is called the House in the Wood, and that was the officers' mess.
So it's clear why Bewley was selected and how many agents used this facility during the war, but what exactly were they learning here?
Before they'd arrived, they started at a place called Womber Manor in Guildford, and there they went through security screening and also a bit of psychological screening. That they'd been up to Arisaig in Scotland to do the commando training, the physical side of things, to see that they'd got a stomach for a fight. They went to Ringway Aerodrome, many of them, to do parachute training. And by the time they came here to Bewley, they were ready to look at the specialist skills. There was arson, there was assassination, burglary, safe breaking, disguises, using inks, special inks that they could use for invisible writing and so on, and one particular skill called silent killing. So it was quite an interesting timetable.
And in terms of the instructors, I mean, many people will rightly celebrate the work of the agents, but those doing the training had a vital role in inventing this new craft of warfare.
If I start by saying that one of the trainers here, one of the instructors, was a certain Kim Philby, who eventually defected to the Russians, he described his fellow instructors here as a shoal of pretty odd fish. There was a man called Johnny Romensky, who's the most notorious Scottish criminal of all times. They found out he had certain skills that they could use, and they got him released from Berlin jail on a special licence. There was also an actor, darling, called Peter Follis, who was out of the Old Vic. But, you know, an actor knows all about disguising your face, how to use makeup, how to change your clothes and change your character. He came down here and worked on that sort of thing. A shoal of pretty odd fish.
Now, you talk about implements. The gadgets of special operations are one of the most fascinating and I suppose tactile bits of the story. You've got a few bits and pieces, haven't you, we can have a look at?
I have indeed, yes.
Should we take a wander into the woods and have a look?
Right, will do.
Well, this isn't the sort of thing I'm used to finding in the middle of the woods, John.
In the 1940s, of course, every home would have one, and they would stay in a secure house, or what they hoped would be a secure house, the agents in occupied territory, and if there was one of these available, they would hope it would be somewhere they could hide their secret messages. And there it is.
So simple.
It's as simple as that. Yeah. Here's another one. I'm not a pipe smoker, but these were obviously commonly used in the 1940s, and if you're an agent, where better to hide your secret message than in the...
And I suppose the pipe would still work?
Yes, of course, yes. So you would hope then that if the Germans were searching a property or looking for secret messages, that they might not look in your pipe.
Now, I mean, not to take away from the work they were doing and the danger that was involved, It must have been great fun coming up with these ruses on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if you were that famous Q-like figure who invented all this stuff,
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
you know, the world was your oyster.
It must set the creative juices going, and I'm sure they were the sort of people that would wake up at 2 in the morning with a wonderful spark of ideas and try and introduce them. Of course, for the agents, it was very, very different, and very often it was a matter of life and death. I've got one more that, again, is a similar thing. Charles Fraser Smith, who made all these devices during the war for not only SOE but other parts of the Allied activity, he went to Parker Pens, and you know that a fountain pen has like a rubber belly inside that holds the ink. Well, they made a pen that had only half the length of the rubber belly, so it created a void in the bottom of the pen, and again it was somewhere they could hide the secret information.
But isn't that the fascinating thing? It's using everyday items that would arouse the least suspicion, but rethinking how they could be used for covert ops.
Exactly, and they've devised ideas not only for household items like this and the candlestick, but items that they could deploy outside and that were much more lethal.
Hence, being here in the forest.
That's right. We've got a few over here that we can look at.
You're going to tell me this pile of logs, innocuously placed here, is what we should be looking at?
That, in fact, represents a pile of logs that the SOE agents during the war might have tampered with, as we might say, and placed inside explosives, so that when and if they would be in a store outside a factory or someplace where the Germans had a boiler or a furnace locally and so on, and they were wood-fired, they would, obviously the Germans would pick these up, throw them into the furnace, and bang.
Brilliant.
And that wasn't the only means of doing that. We have here some very innocent looking pieces of coal.
I mean,
and the idea of putting explosives in coal, again, wasn't new.
There's nothing in here, right?
Not in these.
There we are, just to check.
You're perfectly safe. But in the American Civil War,
Yeah.
The Americans came up with the idea. They made cast iron replicas of coal, stuffed it with explosives, and they would put it. Well, yes, and they would put it in piles of coal that were being used by Confederate troops. And so when the men fired the boiler of the troop trains, bang.
Brilliant. So simple.
And the SOE did exactly the same with the Germans.
What else have we got here?
We've got a character over here.
Yes, the rat.
We haven't got the real thing, but this represents a whole number of rats that were prepared for SOE use. They were cut open, the intestines were taken out, and they were filled with plastic explosives. And the aim was for agents to receive these behind enemy lines and get members of the resistance in the local area to get into German factories and warehouses and so on, leave the dead rat lying around, and of course a vigilant soldier, German soldier, would pick it up and pitch it into a furnace or into a fire to get rid of the carcass, but of course it would have the effect of blowing the place to pieces.
They were an extraordinary bunch, and it's interesting standing here 70 years after the war in what is, let's face it, another forest to anyone else, but the idea that these young men and women were training here, learning an astonishing, an extraordinary craft, if you will, and then taking that knowledge really into the cauldron of occupied Europe, does make you wonder, doesn't it?
The war produced many, many brave and heroic people, and the SOE operation was only a small part of our success. It was only a small part of the operations that turned the tide of the war, but they were really quite remarkable.
A year after the Battle of Britain had ended in late 1941, black Lysander aircraft began to appear in the hangars here at Tangmere. But what they were for, well, only a few people knew.
The mission of the pickup pilots in 161 Special Duty Squadron with the Lysanders was to insert agents into a field somewhere in France, obviously to recover agents from the field, and they would also have lots of packages which might have weapons in, it might have money in, they might be recovering intelligence packages and that sort of thing.
Tangmere was selected due to its proximity to occupied France. Flights were short both on time and fuel.
All of the pickup operations from Tangmere were scheduled to take place during the full moon period, or the moon period as it was called. The reason for that was because the pilots actually navigated by the light of the moon. Now rivers, lakes and roads, particularly wet roads, shine up very, very well at night by moonlight. And so they would choose some major intersections or major rivers, heading for usually the Loire, where the majority of the landing fields were. When they reached the landing field, the reception committee would hear the noise of the Lysander overhead, would flash a recognition code, which the pilot would reply to. He would then touch down, taxi back to the touchdown point. That's where the exchange of agents would take place. The packages would be handed in or handed out.
The pickup pilots used two types of aircraft in their covert operations, the Lysander and the Lockheed Hudson. The Lysander was good at short landings and takeoffs, but could carry only 2 to 4 passengers, whereas the Hudson could carry up to 10. But being bigger, it required more space to touch down.
The primary reason for painting the Lysanders black was because people thought that a black aeroplane at night would be almost invisible. And to a certain extent, that is true. But Squadron Leader Hugh Verity, when he took over 161 Squadron, he discovered that if you were flying above a black Lysander on a moonlit night, it stands out really quite markedly from above. Not so much from below, but certainly from above. So he had all of his Lysanders painted on the top of the wings with a green, almost a disruptive pattern on them, so that from above they tended more to merge into the ground patterns below them than have a bright black surface, which rather like the roads and the rivers reflected the moonlight.
The secret full moon squadrons carried out over 1,000 sorties, dropping over 900 SOE agents into occupied Europe.
Something which was quite important was that the pilots never had a relationship with the agents. They didn't know their names, were never introduced. Whether they were male or female, the pilots always knew them as Joes. So they were taking ex-Joes out and bringing ex-Joes back, and of course that was the way it had to be for reasons of security. They were all sorts of different people, and it was the attitude and the drive and the desire of the pilot to want to do the job that I think was the most important thing of all.
Now, we're all familiar with the bravery of the RAF's fighter and bomber pilots, but I wonder how many of us really appreciate the risks run by SOE's pickup pilots taking agents into and out of occupied Europe. Well, here at Lydd Airport on the Kent coast, I've got the perfect opportunity to find out, to get a real sense of some of the hazards involved. As you can see, the sun is setting. I've got an aircraft fueled and ready to go, which means it's time for a bit of nighttime covert flying once it gets dark.
.7066 for the basic service reserve.
Now, my pilot tonight is Barry. Barry, you're just finishing your pre-flight checks. Yep. We're all pretty much good to go.
We are just about ready to go. We are allowed to taxi. We're just allowing the engines to warm up a little bit more.
Now, tonight, of course, we've got a modern twin-engine aircraft. During the war, they were using single-engine Lysanders, which made the whole thing much more hazardous. At least we've got one extra engine should things go wrong. But they won't, will they, Barry?
Not planning on it. OK, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Disappearing into the quickening dusk. Now, Barry, you've studied these SOE pickup pilots yourself. They were undertaking the most extraordinary missions.
They were, and
much less technical aeroplanes than this one, and they would navigate their way across the channel where there is no landmarks between that, all the way across towards France, and dead reckoning most of the way on just one big compass that's generally between their legs and a map.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because obviously, you know, it's peacetime, the lights are on below us, both in Britain and of course in occupied Europe, all the lights would have been off during the blackout. So they'd been very difficult to actually, you know, find your landmarks, presumably just following railway lines, bodies of water, any clue. Now tonight we are undertaking something of an experiment with, of course, help of Barry and the team down at Lydd Airport. Now, modern airports generally have their lights on 24/7 just in case of emergencies, but tonight they're turning off the runway lights, and that's because we've got a team on the ground who are armed with torches to try and recreate the approach that SOE pilots had to make when they came in to occupied Europe. Now, they weren't finding regular airfields, these were simply open areas that the resistance had chosen for that night's operation. Now, this is how the process worked, roughly speaking. On the ground, a resistance reception committee would have selected the landing site. They'd have been listening for the aircraft coming in as we are now. We're going to start looking for a flash from the ground, a coded signal in Morse. Now, if we felt it was the right signal, we would return our flash. At that point, a series of L-shaped landing lights would come on to determine the angle of approach, and the L would basically operate like this. We would fly into the bottom of the L, and that bit of it would determine where the end of the runway was. Now, the business of landing was crucial to get right. It was in and out in 5 minutes. The pilot would land, taxi to the end of the runway, ready to take off again, and only at that point would he dispatch his cargo and take on anyone else he was bringing back. Ground crew, this is Jules from the plane. Please show us your Morse signal. There we are. Very dim. Just goes to show how hard it is to spot, actually. Okay, team, show us your landing lights, your L lights. There it is. There we are. There's our landing strip. Well done, team. That looks fantastic. Well, I think Lydd can turn their landing lights back on now, can't they?
Yeah, I think we've practiced that.
Brilliant. Well, Barry, I think it's a really interesting illustration of just how difficult it was to pinpoint those landing sites. Can you begin to imagine what was going through those pilots' minds back then?
No, I can't. Simply because they had one chance to get this right.
Well, here we are just coming back in towards Lydd over the Kent coast. What a happy sight, a reassuring sight that would have been for these SOE pilots.
Absolutely. And they know they're going to get home, have a nice warm dinner, and more importantly, a nice coffee too.
Tell you what, Barry, it's on me. Get me down in one piece and I'm fine.
No worries.
The pilots flying from airfields such as Tangmere, Biggin Hill and Coningsby risked their lives each time they took to the sky. Throughout the Battle of Britain, pilots suffered horrendous burns as their Hurricanes or Spitfires burst into flames after being hit by enemy fire. In 1941, a club sprang up at the Queen Victoria Hospital in East Grinstead, made up of 39 RAF patients called the Guinea Pig Club. It was spearheaded by pioneering plastic surgeon Sir Archibald Mackindoe.
The Guinea Pig Clubs started as a drinking club. Mackindoe had not wished to have strict discipline in the wards. He very quickly arranged that his patients should wear their uniforms rather than hospital blues. He arranged that they should have a barrel of beer in the ward, and he organised the local people to accept them in their hostelries. He recognised the fact that they had a struggle to return to what was normal life. They were grossly disfigured, and the disfigurement was very largely a matter of communication. It was faces that were disfigured and hands, and these are the principal means of communication from one person to another. The type of injuries that McIndoe was facing did change somewhat. In a fighter plane, particularly the Spitfire, the high-octane fuel was in a tank which was more or less in the patient's lap. In a Hurricane, the petrol tanks were in the stubs of the wings and therefore on either side.
So we're standing in the operating theatre that Archibald McIndoe used when the theatres were rebuilt at the Queen Victoria Hospital soon after the war. McIndoe didn't just develop lots of new techniques or apply principles. He also was instrumental, dare I say it, in using and developing tools for helping reconstruction. And some of the tools that he used we still use every day. So the scissors that he modified, we use for so many things in reconstruction and in burns. The forceps that he developed, again, we use usually to actually help stitch skin grafts, but also in many of the other reconstructive procedures that we utilise. The effects of McIndoe's work continue to this day. A lot of what he brought into plastic surgery back in the Second World War continues in terms of the psychological support that we give to our patients and the early aggressive surgery that he promoted.
As World War II progressed, the type of patient treated changed from fighter pilots to bomber crews. And by the end of the war, the total number of guinea pigs stood at 649.
Being involved with the Guinea Pig Club has been an inspiration to me. One has to understand that not a single one of them failed to return to some form of normal life, despite residual deformities which can't be treated surgically. And they are, as a body of determined men, they are an inspiration.
War is a great inventor, whether it's in the fields of medicine, science, or engineering. During World War II, aviation technology had made a huge leap forward with the development of the jet engine. In 1946, this Meteor set a new world speed record, a staggering 616 miles an hour. But in peacetime, the technology embodied in aircraft just like this was pushed even further by the need to be faster.
Airspeed records started almost as soon as aeroplanes could fly. In fact, the first records were set by the Wright Flyer in, I think, 1903, and at 6 miles per hour. Progress was fairly rapid. Within 10, 15 years, they were doing 80 to 100 miles an hour, and shortly thereafter, we were talking about hundreds of miles per hour in the 30s and 40s. So it was a fairly rapid progression.
By the early 1920s, aircraft were reaching over 200 miles an hour. The Schneider Trophy air race for seaplanes pushed development even further through competition. And in 1931, Britain achieved over 400 miles an hour in a Supermarine S6B. But it didn't stop there.
It started during the Second World War when we developed jet engines. And Frank Whittle came along, and people didn't believe in jet engines, but the Germans were doing a lot of work as well. And by the end of the war, we had the Meteor, and it actually did, I think, fly several times during the Second World War, but it wasn't a serious contender. But after the Second World War, it was developed, and it broke a number of speed records and also sold a lot of aircraft around the world.
It was just 2 years after the war, in 1947, that the sound barrier is broken by the American Bell X-1. And from there on, airspeed just rocketed. In 1976, the Blackbird by Lockheed reached a staggering 2,193 miles an hour. It's the fastest record for a manned, air-breathing jet aircraft.
I don't think we're going to see an aircraft that is self-propelled and manned flying at maybe 2,500, 3,000 miles per hour again. But if you look to what's happened since with passenger jets, Concorde, for instance, still holds numerous records. Nowadays we have these different class records, which enables people with more normal aircraft, and I could use the word pedestrian, but that's not fair on people, and I hold some records, to do more normal tasks and set records. and we monitor that in the UK. The FAI oversee that, and they have numerous different classes. We can also do altitude, fixed distance, point to point, lots of records to go for.
The 30 or so airfields that were at the heart of the Battle of Britain have had varying careers in the years since the war. The Tangmere story ended on the 16th of October 1970, when a single Spitfire flew over the airfield as the RAF ensign was hauled down for the last time.
Well, today RAF Tangmere is no longer an operational airfield. What's left of its runways are eerily silent, although I am certain that a skillful SOE pilot could still make use of the tarmac that does survive. But you know, seeing such an airbase as this, that's had such a proud and important role in our nation's history, looking rather forlorn and forgotten, does, if I'm honest, make me feel a little bit sad. But thankfully, the work of the museum in preserving the stories and the memories of the thousands of men and women who served here over the years will, I hope, ensure that the Tangmere story is never forgotten. When most people consider military aviation, they tend to focus on the role of the RAF. But for over a century, and 10 years before the RAF was even thought about, the Royal Navy has played a decisive role in the history of military flight. This is the Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton, the operational and spiritual home of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. Over 100 aircraft are based here, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice anywhere around the world. Now, not only is RNAS Yeovilton one of the busiest military airfields in the UK, it's also home to Europe's largest naval aviation collection, and some of its rarest exhibits are housed here in this fabulous hangar. The collection is in large part dominated by Harriers, and this is the latest addition to that collection. It's been delivered straight from Afghanistan, warts and all. Now, in the past, most museum collections would have stripped an aircraft like this down, but not here, not anymore. They're going to preserve this exactly as you see it, complete with sand in the footwell of the cockpit and the fuselage covered in boot and handprints from the crew that prepared it for its trip back to the UK. I love the change. It represents something really exciting in museum curation, and in many respects preserves not just the military history of the aircraft, but also the social history, the men behind the machines. Henry, the collections here are absolutely fabulous, and it seems only fitting that they should be here at Yeovilton. But tell us a bit more about the origins of the air station itself.
Well, in 1937, a Handley Page Harrow aircraft had some engine trouble and needed to force land and found a convenient flat field. In 1938, the chief test pilot of Westlands Aircraft Company in Yeovil, he was sent out to identify a suitable field to establish an airfield where they could test fly their aircraft and deliver them from. But unknown to them, the Admiralty had commandeered the land to create what became Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton, which was finally commissioned as HMS Heron in June 1940.
Now, for anybody not familiar with the term Fleet Air Arm, just define it for us.
Well, the Fleet Air Arm is one of the 4 fighting arms of the Royal Navy, supported by the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The oldest fighting arms are very clearly the surface ships and the Royal Marines, who were established in 1664. The newer arms of the service are, of course, the submariners, the submarine force, and the Fleet Air Arm, both of which developed at much the same time at the beginning of the last century.
In many respects, the role of the Navy, both militarily and politically, has changed over even the last 20, 30 years. How important is aviation to the modern naval role?
Fundamental. There are few operations which do not include aviation. Some simpler evolutions, international engagement can be conducted by some vessels, but most vessels nowadays have some kind of aviation, whether it be a ship's flight of a single Lynx or a Wildcat, or indeed a single Merlin helicopter from Culdrose. And then you build up into the larger amphibious vessels and the larger Royal Fleet Auxiliaries that have a larger number of aircraft on them, and then ultimately the carriers.
Well, Henry, for me, without doubt, perhaps one of the most iconic aircraft that Britain ever produced was this, the Harrier. An incredible machine, and you are one of the lucky few who got to fly these on operations. What was it like?
extraordinary and a phenomenal privilege, of course.
I remember seeing some of that early footage back in the 1970s of the Harrier under trials and watching it make this incredible vertical landing. I mean, the story of aviation development was almost the holy grail.
Well, through the training, of course, you're introduced to it in bite-sized chunks, but you very quickly realise that you didn't so much step into an aircraft, you really strapped it onto your back. And the versatility and flexibility and variety that it gave you always kept it interesting.
Now, over your many hours of flying these aircraft, were there any particularly tricky moments?
There were, or there was one in particular when I was forced to eject over South Wales. When the aircraft control system jammed, which subsequently turned out to be a blockage in the control system at the back of the aircraft. But we were flying very low level, the three of us, and as I pushed over a ridge, I remember pushing quite a lot of negative G over a ridge, and as I came to pull back up the other side to avoid the ground on the other side of the small valley, the control column jammed.
Nothing happened.
So I was converging with the ground at 450 miles an hour.
How high were you?
By the time I ejected, it was treetop height, and when I hit the trees, I jumped out.
But you lived to fly another day, and you have the unique distinction of having then gone on to fly the very last operational Harrier and bring it in to another naval air station.
Absolutely. It didn't dent my enthusiasm for flying the aircraft.
Today, there are over 30,000 people in the Royal Navy, a fraction compared to 75 years ago. At the beginning of the Second World War, the Royal Navy was the largest in the world, consisting of 15 battleships, 66 cruisers, 184 destroyers, 45 escort and patrol vessels, and 60 submarines. RNAS Yeovilton was tasked with training from practical aerial gunnery to landing on aircraft carriers.
Now, during the Second World War, it wasn't just pilots and ground crew that were trained here at Yeovilton. Large numbers of the Women's Royal Naval Service, or the Wrens, also came here for an intensive 18-week training period, and it covered all sorts of things from airmanship to meteorology and radio work. But one of the key skills they had to master was that of the aerial plot. How to get information about the course and speed of aircraft in the air to a map or plot on the ground. Now, you'd be right in thinking it's a fairly difficult operation, but here at Yeovilton, well, they came up with their own homegrown way of making it a lot easier. Dave.
Lovely to meet you.
Nice to see you too, sir. Now look, I've come armed with my own Spitfire.
Okay, well, at Yeovilton we'd recognise that as a Seafire, but yes, okay.
All right, a Seafire. Now, the business of plotting was so crucial, and it is still so crucial, in getting aircraft into the right place at the right time. But here at Yeovilton during the Second World War, they practiced it out here on the airfield. What were they doing?
Absolutely. It is vital, and you've got to think now that radar was in its infancy, so the Navy had to come up with a way of being able to teach the air traffic control students and the fighter direction control students to bring aircraft to certain points accurately, on time, without the expense of wasting airtime, without the risk of putting an aircraft and a new student at danger, and of course in a way where they could ideally just stop the clock and go and examine what was going wrong during the training.
The training school would measure out a 10 by 10 square on a plotting table and then equate it to a much larger 10 by 10 square laid out on the airfield. Depending on the scale selected, each 10 by 10 square could represent up to 100 miles of airspace.
Now, you're going to get me to replicate some of this training today. What are we going to do?
Right. Well, you're going to be Fighter Tricycle 1.
Fighter Tricycle 1.
Tricycle 1.
This being my Fighter Tricycle.
This is your Fighter Tricycle 1, FT1, and this is what they used. The tricycle would carry a radio set.
Yep.
It would carry a compass. But the critical thing was the speed. We had to equate a speed, and the crucial piece of kit that you have on board to enable you to do that is a metronome. Because provided you pedal in time with the metronome set at today 54 beats a minute, which matches the gearing of your tricycle to give you the equivalent speed of 200 miles an hour, we should be able to get you around the course.
So I've got my Spitfire here. This is going to be me effectively on my bike, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So where am I going to start and where am I heading?
You're going to start on this side of the board.
So I'll pop that down there.
Indeed.
Okay.
And we will give you a countdown to launch. So I'm going to give you a short course, vector you onto a course to formate with the Sea Hurricane on our board, and hopefully you should arrive on the designated point on our large-scale square today.
Now, I've flown in many historic aircraft. I've never flown, dare I say it, on a tricycle before.
You've
so just
never flown a tricycle before?
Talk me through my aircraft for today, David.
Your aircraft for today is going to have a screen which will give you restricted vision.
Yep.
So that there's no cheating.
How many miles am I going to be flying, do you think?
Let me see, that'll give you about 9 miles flying time.
Okay, right then. Well, it all sounds mind-bogglingly complicated. I can ride a bike, which is good news. I can read a compass, I think. Whether I can pedal in time to the metronome to keep my speed constant for that vital element of 200 miles an hour, that remains to be seen.
That is the secret.
So where am I going to start on our simulated airspace here?
Well, on our square today, we're going to aim you down towards the yellow lines there, get you to do a U-turn, line you up and launch you from that point.
Launch me, great. I'll never take off again, will I? I'll be launched here at Yeovilton. Right, okay. Is there any great trick to actually riding the bike itself?
No, just release the brake when you're ready to go.
So,
and what I'll do is set the metronome going for you, and then you can have a practice pedal to the 54 beats a minute. You just pedal one turn per foot as it clicks around.
And try and read a compass at the same time.
Indeed.
And listen to you.
for the radio command. That's
right then, good luck.
Good luck.
Quite a nice day for a bike ride, really. Okay, Dave, I'm ready for launch.
Ready for launch in 3, 2, 1, launch.
Right, here we go. Tick, top.
Square.
This is me at 200 miles an hour now, screaming through the air, through our tarmac airspace.
Tricycle FT1, vector 270.
270, so I'm heading due north at the moment, which is 0, so I need to bank to the left, 90 degrees, to come on to 270. There we are. Tick, tock, tick.
FT1, vector 090.
090, right, okay, here we go. Turn.
FT1, stand by to stop, and stop.
Stop? Well, Dave, have I managed to find your Sea Hurricane out here?
Let's see how you did. This is what we were hopefully aiming for.
Well, you get that well hidden, a bit of chalk. I mean, in terms of margin of error,
you're about a half a mile south of ideal target. It's okay. I mean, did you slow down pedalling on the uphill leg?
Well, I was just flying the trike, mate. I mean, you were doing the ground controlling, but I might have throttled back a little bit.
Just a little, but that's not bad. I mean, this is the first time this experiment has been run since at least the 1950s, I would think.
You have to wonder if the ghosts of those Wren controllers are looking across here now in the sunshine, having a good laugh.
I think there's a lot of quiet smiling going on. Some are inspecting to Nana this afternoon. That's
absolutely. Well, here's to you lot. Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you.
As an island, Britain needed to import a vast amount of food and military equipment to survive the Second World War. And it was the Royal Navy's job to protect the merchant ships crossing the Atlantic from America. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest battle of the war, lasting 6 years.
German U-boats operated quite close to the UK, and they operated in small numbers. But by the autumn of 1940, after Germany has occupied France, the U-boats are based on the French Biscay coast. There are more of them, and they're starting to work in coordinated groups, wolf packs, that will attack a convoy and try to overwhelm the escort and sink large numbers of merchant ships.
One of the most effective ways of deterring U-boat attack relied upon aircraft. But their range from both America and the UK was limited, and it left a gap in the middle of the Atlantic that U-boats exploited. The Germans called the North Atlantic air gap the Black Pit.
Not only were there problems with resources, but there were also problems with tactics and problems with equipment. Short-range aircraft are one thing, but if you haven't got a bomb that works, that's even worse. The anti-submarine bombs used by RAF's Coastal Command had the habit of bouncing off the sea and exploding underneath the aircraft that had just dropped them. Even if Coastal Command and the Fleet Air Arm didn't have an effective bomb for the opening months of the war, it doesn't mean that they were useless. When an aircraft dove into attack, the reaction of any submarine is to dive. And by diving, you force it to break contact with the convoy.
The Royal Navy didn't have many aircraft carriers, so they used escort and merchant air carriers or MAX ships. These were converted commercial vessels which were adapted to have flight decks. Yeovilton provided training for the pilots landing on board them.
The worst month of the war for Allied shipping was November 1942. 846,000 tonnes of Allied shipping was sunk in that month. Now, some of that wasn't in the Atlantic, but that's still an awful lot of shipping, because you don't just lose the ship and its cargo, you lose every cargo that ship could carry in the future. It is a cumulative loss to the Allied war effort.
By 1943, the Allies had the Liberator, a long-range anti-submarine aircraft. This, with the first escort aircraft carriers, new depth charges and aggressive tactics closed the air gap in the North Atlantic.
If the Germans had broken the convoy routes, Britain would not have been able to pursue the war. Without the convoys, Bomber Command stops flying. Without the convoys, Montgomery's 8th Army doesn't move. Without the convoys, Britain doesn't have food. It is the most important battle of the war.
One aircraft that made a huge contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic was the Fairey Swordfish. It operated from 14 escort carriers and 18 MAX ships. Here at Yeovilton, the Royal Navy Historic Flight have 3 in their collection, and one of only 2 left flying in the world.
Chris!
Hey Jules, how are you?
Nice to see you, mate. Look for the Swordfish and I will find you, and they were absolutely right on this glorious day and this glorious aircraft.
Yeah, it's lovely. Mark 1 Swordfish, just stunning.
And when was this one actually built?
She was built in 1941, when she came into service. The actual type was started flying in 1934, came into service in 1936, and biplanes were pretty well extinct by then anyway.
Can we take a wander around and have a closer look?
Indeed. The interesting thing, obviously, torpedo on the Mark 1 was generally the flavour.
Yeah.
But the good thing about the string bag, and why it's called the string bag, was what we could put onto it, and we could keep putting more and more stuff on. That's what was the key thing. You know, we could put depth charges in, obviously, for the anti-submarine threat. We could put rockets on there as well. So we kept growing it all the time to what the threat was, and that's what makes it a string bag, is what you could keep shoving onto her to make her very effective.
Can we take a closer look at the kind of business end?
Absolutely.
What was the number of crew?
For these Marks 3 crew, pilots obviously sits at the front.
Yep.
Behind him is the observer, and he's in charge of obviously making sure the aircraft gets back to where it needs to go. And behind him was the TAG, which is the telegraph air gunner, and his job was mainly to look after the radio and make sure it worked. And he would actually unwind an aerial when they got airborne into the slipstream, because obviously it's not like a
Just a sort of wire hanging out the back of the aircraft.
Absolutely, a wire hanging out the back of the aircraft and a set of crystals to make sure it worked. And it was a matter of pride, so he would always be sitting in the back there.
Seeing this aircraft today in the glorious and rather cosy surroundings of Somerset is one thing, but we have to picture them on a windswept deck out in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, taking off into a situation which, let's face it, had no guaranteed outcome.
There's a couple of times whereby, they come back, especially on the when you went round the top into, to support Russia. People could be, sub-zero even before getting airborne. 5-6 hours up there, and they had to sometimes be winched out because they physically couldn't stand up again.
Now, this is the oldest aircraft in your collection. Can we take a closer look? What else you've got stashed away there?
Absolutely, come on in.
Now, I know you've also got a Seahawk. That's not here today, is it?
No, she's in the lower hangar, unfortunately, so we can't see her today. But the intention is in time to get that back up and flying. In the meantime, we have this beauty.
You've got this, which you've kind of kept till last, Chris. The Sea Fury. This is an aircraft that you regularly fly, isn't it?
I've been very, very privileged. Yeah, I've got about 232 hours in her during my flying time, and yeah. It's the absolute end point for, British aircraft in the sense of piston. After this, it was all turbines and jets. So this is where the UK stopped and really does typify the end point.
But when were these introduced into service?
Prototypes just at the end of the Second World War came into service in 47.
47, so 1947 for the Fury, 1937 for the Swordfish. But what a change, what a difference.
Yes, indeed. It's just stunning to see how the development through time of not only obviously the airframe aerodynamics, but the engine, and this typifies pretty well everything out it. It's basically close to a jet. It's not a jet, obviously, because of the whirly bit at the front, but it goes awfully fast. 380 knots is generally very easy in it. The limit is 425 knots. You know, it's 450 miles an hour out of a piston engine aircraft.
And clearly appointed for naval use with these folding wings to allow it to cram onto those busy carrier decks.
Absolutely, yeah. Footprint on board the ship is a massive point for all aircraft, and therefore, yes, folding wings, as does the Swordfish, they fold back. In this case, these ones fold up. On these particular sides, you could put rockets up the side of the aircraft or bombs, or you could put 500-pound bombs on the inboard or 1,000-pound bombs or fuel tanks. And the fuel tank could actually have a camera in as well, so it could do multi-role. And this one was a fighter bomber again. So mainly the air-to-air still was, in this particular case, cannons. And this one has obviously 4 30mm ones. And then finally the rockets.
Now, keeping these aircraft in the air decades after they were ever designed to be still flying is a hazardous business, as you know well, because you have had a little upset in one of these, haven't you?
Absolutely, yes. Unfortunately, I had an engine failure in the Sea Fury down at Coldrose on the 31st of July. Anything mechanical can break, whether it be from that era all the way through to now. It was 60 seconds, which was quite emotional.
You saved yourself, and in large part the aircraft too, for which you were rightly awarded the Air Force Cross.
Yeah, no, I'm still getting to sort of terms with that award.
But it goes to highlight the hazards of keeping these aircraft alive, but also I think you probably agree it's still a worthwhile operation to allow the public to see these aircraft still airworthy, still in the skies above us, to remind us of their heritage and their pedigree.
Without doubt, you know, if we forget our history at our peril, it comes around again. The key thing for us is obviously highlighting the Earth is 70% water. You know, we have to have a navy to go out and do things, take the fight out to places, or support humanitarian aid, whatever it may be. That's what we need, and we need, you know, platforms such as this. And, you know, the key flexibility, we can operate both from land and from sea, and that's what the key thing is for us.
In the 1930s, the Royal Navy showed remarkable foresight in carrying out tests with the predecessor to the helicopter, the autogyro. They landed one on the deck of HMS Furious, one of the earliest aircraft carriers. That prompted the Navy to think further about the use of rotorcraft in naval operations. So they approached the Americans, where helicopter development was well underway.
The first real use of them was in casualty evacuation from battlefields and so on, and also pulling pilots who'd crashed on takeoff from, or indeed from landing from carriers. But now we use them for a much, much wider range of things with, if we think about the way that the Fleet Air Arm operates all around the world, then we've got helicopters being used for drug controls in the Caribbean. We're using them for anti-piracy around the Horn of Africa. And of course in a variety of different ways in humanitarian rescues.
The first order for a naval helicopter, the Sikorsky R4, later known as the Hoverfly, was in 1943. And since then, there have been over 150 different types of helicopter produced.
If I was to choose some iconic helicopters, I'd probably go for the Dragonfly, the Whirlwind, the Lynx and the Wessex 5. Dragonfly because it was the first really capable helicopter that the Fleet Air Arm had, used for casualty evacuation and for what's called plane guard, picking pilots up out of the water. But it was very limited in its capability to do much more. Then we move on to the Whirlwind, which was built in a number of styles, but the later Whirlwinds actually started to carry anti-submarine detection equipment and the ability to drop a torpedo. It was the Wessex 5, which used in Borneo during the confrontation in the mid-1960s, that got the name of Commando Helicopter Squadrons of the Junglies, because of flying in and out of jungle clearings and so on. And then finally I'd go for the Lynx, which operated from here at Yeovilton for many years. Very fast, very manoeuvrable, but of course it was the Lynx that went on to, in modified form, take the world helicopter speed record in the early 1980s.
The Navy has long been at the forefront of rotary aviation, and in 1947 the Navy formed 705 Squadron, the first ever British Armed Forces squadron devoted entirely to helicopters.
The story of helicopters has been one of continuous development. Faster, bigger, more load, more capability. The Sea King's going out of service, the Lynx is going out of service to be replaced respectively by the Merlin and the Wildcat. And in each case, they're bigger, they are more powerful, they have more modern avionics, digital electronics and so on, can carry in different and more sophisticated weaponry, can carry more, can go further, can do more. That's the next chapter in the book of helicopters.
Up until recently, the Westland Sea King was the giant of the Fleet Air Arm. But after over 40 years of service, carrying Royal Marines, field guns, troops, and thousands of tons of relief supplies around the world, they're now being retired. Neil.
Great to see you.
Very nice to see you, sir. This is a real treat to get up close and personal with, I think, one of the most iconic aircraft that Britain's operated over the last 40 odd years or so.
I think so. I mean, obviously nearly 4 decades in service with the Sea King and Sea King Mark IV in particular. I've been flying since 1991 and had a wonderful time, absolutely wonderful time, on operations around the globe for nearly 40 years.
But its reputation for being able to operate in the most demanding of environments and its robustness are legendary. What is it about this aircraft that's made it so successful?
I think it is exactly that. It's just been everywhere and done everything. There isn't a theatre of operations that we haven't taken the Sea King to, whether that's from the maritime onto the land, in the Arctic, in the desert, in the jungle, or just in temperate climes. It's been everywhere and done everything.
Can we take a wander along the body
yeah.
and get a sense of it? Because there are so many features in the design of this aircraft that I think really distinguish it. That lovely bow, that almost like a flying boat bow that sits at the front.
Well, exactly that. It's got a boat-shaped hull. It was designed to be a sea-going aeroplane, and should the worst come to the worst, obviously it had the boat-shaped hull for when it landed on the sea.
But looking at the tail here, again, it almost looks like the stern of a ship. I mean, we never seem to see them floating around on water, but they were designed to do that.
Absolutely, yeah, and some nations actually practice landing on the water and taking off from it as well with a Sea King. We didn't have the pleasure of that.
I mean, we tend to imagine them in combat roles, particularly with regard to the Royal Marines, of course, and the Commando Helicopter Force, but their role in disaster relief over the last 40 years has also been pretty impressive.
Absolutely, as recently as the Philippines Operation Patwin just a couple of years ago, they were embarked in HMS Illustrious, which steamed quickly to go to the aid of those in the Philippines and provided a huge amount of aid, just whether it's relief stores, lifting them into place or moving people around to the less hit areas. So yeah, absolutely.
I share your sense of sadness that we are coming to the end of an era, but the future is also very, very exciting. What's going to replace this aircraft?
Seems like a good time to go and show you the Merlin.
Well.
So here's the replacement. The Merlin Mark III, which we've inherited from the Royal Air Force. It's been operational for 10 years already, and we'll be doing much the same thing, but just taking it to sea and doing the same as we have been with the Sea King. A great bit of kit and a 21st century helicopter, just a huge improvement on what we had with the Sea King beforehand.
I mean, it is clearly a lot bigger than a Sea King. In terms of its capability, how has that been enhanced?
You say, first of all, you say it's a lot bigger, but actually the footprint and where the undercarriage there sits is pretty much the same as a Sea King was, so that we can fit it onto the back of all the decks that we used to operate the Sea King from beforehand. But it does, even within that footprint, provide almost double the capability that we used to have on the Sea King.
One of the most distinguishing features, I suppose, has to be that tail ramp. Can we have a look?
Absolutely, yeah, let's go and have a look. It's a lot better for ingress and egress of the aeroplane with the extra access. We've got the door similar to the Sea King on the front left, a similar door on the right, but clearly the ramp at the back here, which provides easier access for the troops. And as you can see,
it's cavernous.
It's absolutely significantly bigger.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it speaks for itself, really, the volume.
It does, absolutely. I mean, you look at compared to the back of the Sea King. The Sea King was designed to take 27 in the troops in the back of it, but they're tiny seats and no room for any of their kit around it. Bigger troop seats, a lot more room in between for all their kit as well. 24 fully laden troops, pretty comfortable to go into the fight wherever they need to go.
But the whole thing is just much more ergonomic, isn't it? I mean, these seats, the way everything folds away, it's just been designed with modern operations in mind, more so than the Sea King could ever have been conceived for, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, there's obviously different variants of the Merlin. We've got the anti-submarine variant down at Culdrose as well, also operated by the Navy. But this one, troop design, designed for troops, to take troops into battle, and it's perfect for it. Everything down to communications leads, to seats, to the room for all their kit in between. It's ideal.
I can tell you're extremely excited about this aircraft, Neil.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've only had a couple of weeks flying it myself, but it's great fun. It goes further, it goes quicker. It's really smooth aeroplane to operate, and a dream for the pilot up the front as well.
So, what's the length of service that we'd expect to see the Merlin in for?
Well, at least until 2030, probably 2040. It's all a bit up in the air at the moment, but for at least another 15 to 20 years.
Now, I can see and hear an awful lot of flying going on today, Neil. Very, very cheeky question. What are the chances of getting in the air?
I'd be delighted. I'm sure we can sort something. Just a choice to make, Sea King or Merlin.
A choice I was not expecting. Crikey. Well, look, I've potentially got another 40 years to fly in one of these. But Sea King, if it's going out of service, it's such an iconic aircraft. That's my choice.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Well, we're finally airborne in this wonderful Sea King. Very historic aircraft. I think John is going to open the door. Open it up. Fantastic. There we go. Doors open, and there is Somerset below me. It's incredibly smooth, actually. Much smoother than I was expecting it to be. Yeah? Especially given the weather.
It just depends what pilot you get, to be honest.
Yeah, Roger.
Lucky you got the cream of the crop that sat up the front.
Well, we're now flying over the airfield. What a fantastic view of its main runway there. John, this is a sight you've seen many times, but I guess you never tire of it from where you're sat now.
That's right, I absolutely love it sitting up here.
It's much more compact than you appreciate on the ground.
It is, yeah.
You're going to jump over here towards the door. You get a real sense of that downwash from the blade, but also the heat from the exhaust that's washing down the side of the aircraft. But what a view! Now I'm being played today by Matt and Alex, who are up the front. Let's go and get a pilot's eye view of this lovely aircraft. Matt, as I understand it, you were the last pilot to qualify on the Sea King, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, finally finished flight training in December, and then got my wings in January of this year.
So 5 years training, just when you've jumped in the hot seat, they're going to take it away from you.
Yeah, I'll have about just over 2 years of flying the Sea King. Yeah, should be converting over to the Berlin, hopefully at some point next year.
But Alex, I guess you've served around the world?
Yeah, I say around the world, most of the time in Afghanistan for the last 6 years or so.
Yep.
So I joined the front line in 2008, right when it was starting to get all heated.
And are you both looking forward to getting your hands on a Merlin?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's a lovely aircraft. It sits out there.
There it is. I mean, what a view. I mean, it's an interesting kind of aerial transition, this, from the old to the new, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So there we are. We're heading straight towards Glastonbury Tour. So we are virtually at treetop level now. I mean, great demonstration of why the helicopter in general is such a useful aircraft. John, this will make you smile. As a kid, 40 odd years ago, I used to play with this little toy Sea King. It's slightly battered and bruised. I never thought I'd ever have the chance to get him one, let alone fly him one. But there it is, airborne at last, 4 years later. But somehow rather sad to think that this is one of the last landings that aircraft like this are going to make in the foreseeable future. But we have seen the future, of course. The Merlin flying alongside us today. In 40 years' time, I wonder what they'll be talking about.
Without a doubt, the Navy's most impressive piece of kit has to be their biggest. I am, of course, talking about aircraft carriers. As helicopters and jets become larger and more powerful, they require more space to manoeuvre. HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales will be the largest carriers ever built for the Royal Navy.
We're very proud in the Royal Navy that we invented aircraft carriers, and we were the first to use them as a real part of a battle group at sea. And the first famous battle that is largely attributed to be the model for carrier strike operations is the Battle of Taranto, which was on the 11th of November 1940. And that's when Swordfish aircraft from HMS Illustrious really neutralised the Italian fleet in the harbour of Taranto in southern Italy and really turned the tide of the war in the Mediterranean. So if we fast forward a few decades and the invasion of the Falklands by Argentina in 1982, and the Britains sailed a task force down there to reclaim the islands, if we hadn't had Harrier jets operating off our aircraft carriers there, we wouldn't have been able to defend the fleet, and we most certainly wouldn't probably been able to win the war.
The Navy currently has 64 surface warships, 10 submarines and 13 ships of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The latest addition to the fleet is the aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth.
The whole shape of the Royal Navy is built around the ability to project a task force at sea. So when this ship sails, she'll be accompanied by destroyers and frigates and submarines and oil tankers and solid support shipping, and so very, very much providing the flagship of the Royal Navy.
HMS Queen Elizabeth is 283 metres long, 73 metres wide and 56 metres from the keel to the masthead. She'll carry up to 50 aircraft and a crew of 1,600. The carrier has a power plant of 110 megawatts. That's enough to power a town the size of Swindon.
Where we're standing right now is the top of the ski jump ramp. And that's one of the really unique things. It's a British invention, and there are very few aircraft carriers employ them. Of course, we don't have catapults and arrestor gear. So the way the aircraft launch from our flight deck is what we call a short takeoff and vertical landing. So they'll be on full power, they'll launch themselves from near the back of the ship, they'll accelerate down the runway, and this ski jump here provides a little bit of extra lift to get them up and into the air.
HMS Queen Elizabeth will be fully operational and ready to enter service by 2020, with HMS Prince of Wales following in 2022.
We are very proud to be a part of these ships. They are the centrepiece of the Royal Navy, they are the flagships of the Royal Navy, and what better name to have for our ship than our monarch HMS Queen Elizabeth. So I think we can be very proud to be bringing these into service, and I think for the next 50 years the nation will be glad that we did.
The Navy's aircraft don't just operate from aircraft carriers, they're also found on destroyers and frigates. The newest member of the impressive naval fleet of helicopters is the Wildcat, a multi-role aircraft that can do just about anything.
Hugh, as squadron numbers go, 825 has an illustrious history and now been reformed and re-equipped with these fabulous new aircraft.
Yeah, no, we're very, very lucky. I mean, obviously we've got these, say, the brand new Wildcat, and it stems back, say, the history of the squadron. Honours in World War II, reformed for Korea, most recently in 1982 for the Falklands War, and then, say, back today as a training unit, but also as a frontline squadron with these brand new aircraft.
I mean, this hangar is absolutely extraordinary. I have seen quite a few on my travels over the last few months, but this one is immaculate. It is like walking into a new car showroom, and everything has that new car smell about it. Is Christmas come early to Ableton with this new fleet?
Well, we certainly think so. It's an immaculate squadron, and the aircraft itself, it looks brand new. It is brand new, clearly worth a lot of money, a huge investment, and it's a huge leap forward from our perspective in terms of what we had before.
But even just looking at the tail section there, that looks very different to anything I've seen on a helicopter.
It is. I mean, the aircraft itself, it's predominantly designed around its aerodynamics, and it's much more powerful. It needs to be more powerful to carry the extra equipment we've got.
Yeah.
So the tail is aerodynamically based to apply some additional torque reaction force for us.
Now, in the past, 825 operated as a single squadron, but I understand that these aircraft will be deployed singly to individual frigates and destroyers with a multi-role capability in mind. Give us an idea of the sort of task that these aircraft will have to undertake in the future.
You're absolutely right, Jules. And we deploy as a single aircraft, single crew, single team of engineers onto a ship, and we'll do whatever that ship requires of us. Our primary role is anti-surface warfare, so finding ships, identifying them, and then using a strike capability if necessary. We can also carry weapons for anti-submarine warfare, be they torpedoes or depth charge, but also we carry a search and rescue capability, and we've got one aircraft deployed at this time out in the Caribbean, and there's going to be many more in the future.
Now, none of these aircraft, as I'm looking at them, seem obviously armed, but they are distinguished by that extraordinary feature on the nose, which I gather gives them their unique capability over and above their predecessors.
Absolutely right. There's a couple of large bumps on the nose. One is the radar underneath, which is a huge step forward. That's 360 degrees, where previously the Lynx was 180. But we've also got the camera, as you say. So once we've detected the contact out there using the radar, the camera is fantastic for identifying what that is, and it works up to significantly larger ranges than we're used to. And it's very much the same you sort of see on police helicopters nowadays, with a few subtle amends for the military use.
Now, I imagine internally it's also been radically rethought. What are the chances of getting a look inside?
No, we can certainly do that. I say externally you've noticed some of the differences. Internally is radically different, and I've got one powered up over here, so we can go and have a look at that.
You see, I asked you that cheekily. I thought you were going to say no and it was all top secret.
Would I?
Well, Hugh, this really does represent a revolution. This is the most clinically clean cockpit I think I've yet seen in an aircraft. It looks much simpler, much easier to operate. What's it like to fly?
It's absolutely fantastic. I mean, in terms, much more power than we're used to, significantly more manoeuvrable. Very similar to the Lynx in terms of how it flies, but smoother, and I say that extra power makes a real difference. It's the glass cockpit that we've been waiting for, hugely versatile, all entirely integrated. You can see we've got 4 screens in front of us. I've got mine on the right-hand side to fly, with all my flying instruments on, and then the left 3 can be used for all manner of different things. From the camera on the left, you can see we've got 2 different digital mapping setups there, but we can also put the radar on there, and flexibility across the board, really.
So clearly there, your air charts, and in front of me here, this rather ghostly infrared image of that tug out there in the hangar. Can I adjust the camera?
Feel free to.
Left or right?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's very sensitive, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, terrifyingly like a video game, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very, very sensitive, as you say, and the guys spend a lot of time training on it to make sure they can use it to detect the contacts out there.
But an extraordinary range that really gives this aircraft a capability far in excess of anything that you've been able to fly before.
Absolutely. I mean, the radar gives us fantastic detection ranges, and the camera is absolutely fantastic in terms of identifying what we've managed to detect, and the ranges we get on that, again, leaps and bounds ahead of what we're used to.
Well, the Wildcat is known only to a handful of people at the moment, but I suspect in the years to come it will become a household name, just as the Lynx was.
Absolutely, yeah. It's going to be a stalwart of the Fleet Air Arm for many years to come.
In the history of military flight, the role of the Royal Navy has often been overlooked, but its contribution to the development of aviation and our nation's history as a whole has been as important as it has been decisive. From its very first aircraft right through to its modern multi-role helicopters and fast jets of today, naval air power has given the Royal Navy a reach and capability far beyond that of its surface fleet. So next time you turn on the news and catch a glimpse of one of these aircraft working somewhere around the world, spare a thought that it probably started out life here at a field in Somerset.